Hello friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. Growing up in the Wabanaki tribe, I learned early that the woods around our town weren't just trees and underbrush. They were alive with history, with stories passed down through generations. My name is Isaac Penobscot, and I've spent my life working with the wood from these forests, transforming rough-hewn lumber into furniture, homes, and structures that would last generations. There's something deeply satisfying about working with your hands, about taking something raw and natural and shaping it into something useful, something beautiful. The satisfaction of carpentry had always brought me peace. Even after our parents passed, even after Tommy came back from Afghanistan with shadows in his eyes, I could lose myself in the rhythm of sawing, planing, and sanding. The familiar scent of sawdust and wood oil would ground me, remind me of who I was and where I came from. But peace, like wood, can splinter and break. Sometimes the things we build crack under pressure we never expected them to bear. Sometimes the foundations we trust most deeply crumble beneath our feet. It was early autumn when everything changed. The maples and oaks had transformed into towers of gold and crimson, their leaves drifting down to carpet the forest floor in a rustling blanket of color. The air had that crisp edge to it, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. I was working on a restoration project that would eventually shatter everything I thought I knew about our quiet corner of Maine. The Carruthers house stood on the outskirts of Greenville, a Victorian-era structure that had been slowly decomposing for the better part of a century. It had belonged to Harlan Carruthers, a trapper who vanished in the winter of 1954. The official story was that he'd gotten lost in a blizzard, but the whispered versions painted a darker picture. Tales of strange noises in the night, of children who went missing, of tracks in the snow that didn't match any known animal. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a local historian with more enthusiasm than common sense, had recently purchased the property. She had grand plans to turn it into a museum celebrating Greenville's logging and trapping history. When she approached me about the restoration work, I hesitated. The practical part of my brain saw a paying job during a slow season. The part of me that remembered my grandmother's warnings about places where bad things had happened wanted nothing to do with it. Money won out over superstition. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened to that deeper wisdom, the kind that runs in Wabanaki blood like sap through maple trees. The unease started the moment I set foot on the property. The air felt wrong, thick and stagnant, like breathing through wet wool. The birds were too quiet. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place, creating a pocket of stillness around the house that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd been working alone for 3 days, focusing on the structural assessment, when Tommy showed up. He'd been having a rough time lately, the anniversary of his deployment weighing heavily on him. Working with his hands seemed to help, so I didn't turn him away when he offered to help. "Place gives me the creeps," he said, running his calloused hands along a rotting window frame. "Reminds me of those abandoned compounds we used to clear." I nodded, understanding the connection. "Different kind of haunted," I replied, measuring a section of damaged flooring. "Folks around here say Carruthers was into some dark stuff. Grandmother used to say he'd made deals with things that live in the deep woods." Tommy laughed, but it was forced. "Yeah, what kind of things?" "The kind our people knew to stay away from," I said, marking the floor with my pencil. "The kind that hunger." We worked in silence after that, the only sounds the scrape of tools and the occasional groan of settling wood. The basement was our primary concern. The foundation showed signs of serious deterioration, and we needed to shore up the support beams before we could do any work upstairs. The cellar was surprisingly large for a house of that era, with rough stone walls that disappeared into shadows our work lights couldn't quite penetrate. The air was worse down there, carrying a metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies and rust. "Check this out," Tommy called from near the back wall. He was running his fingers along the stonework, tracing what looked like intentional patterns carved into the rock. "These symbols look familiar to you?" I moved closer, shining my flashlight on the wall. The markings were crude but deliberate, spirals and angular shapes that tickled something in the back of my mind, something I'd seen in our grandmother's books about the old ways. "They're wards," I said slowly, recognition dawning. "Protection symbols, but not ours. European, maybe, like they were trying to keep something in rather than out." Tommy's expression darkened. "Well, that's not creepy at all." He stepped back from the wall, wiping his hands on his jeans as if the stone had left something on them. "Let's get these support beams up and get out of here. This place is starting to mess with my head." We found it the next day, while we were removing a section of the damaged wall to install new support beams. The stone crumbled away easily, too easily, revealing a cavity behind it that shouldn't have been there. The smell hit us first, a sickly sweet odor of decay that had somehow been trapped in that space for decades. "Tommy, grab the big flashlight," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He handed it to me without a word, and I aimed the beam into the darkness. The skulls were the first things I saw, small, delicate things that had no business being hidden in a wall. 4 of them, arranged in a rough semicircle like audience members at some grotesque theater. The rest of the bones were scattered around them, some still bearing the tattered remains of children's clothing. Tommy made a sound somewhere between a curse and a prayer. "Jesus Christ, Isaac, those are kids." "We need to call the sheriff," I said, already reaching for my phone. But before I could dial, a sound stopped me cold. A scratching noise, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the wall. "That's not rats," Tommy whispered, unconsciously shifting into a defensive stance. His military training was kicking in, preparing for a threat he couldn't yet identify. The scratching grew louder, more purposeful. It seemed to be moving closer, accompanied by a wet sliding sound that made my stomach turn. And then we saw it, or rather we saw parts of it, emerging from the darkness like something from a nightmare. It moved like a predator, but wrong, its body too long, too fluid. Its skin was a patchwork of gray and black, slick in some places and covered in patchy fur in others. But its face, God, its face. It was like someone had tried to create a wolf from description alone and gotten everything horrifically wrong. The jaw opened too wide, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, arranged in concentric circles like a lamprey. The thing pulled itself fully into the light, and I felt my mind trying to reject what I was seeing. It was roughly the size of a large dog, but its proportions were all wrong. Its front legs were longer than its back ones, ending in hands that were almost human but with too many joints. Its spine rippled beneath its skin like a handful of snakes fighting beneath a blanket. Everything happened too fast after that. The creature lunged at Tommy, moving with impossible speed. I heard him cry out as its claws raked across his side, leaving deep gashes in his shirt that immediately began to darken with blood. I had my framing hammer in my hand. I don't remember grabbing it, but suddenly it was there. I swung it with everything I had, connecting with the thing's ribs with a sound like breaking branches. It recoiled, making a noise that started as a hiss and ended as something horribly close to human laughter. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Tommy toward the stairs. He stumbled but kept moving, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. I could hear the creature recovering behind us, its claws scraping against the stone floor as it gathered itself for another attack. We burst out of the cellar into the fading daylight, but the thing followed. It moved differently in the open air, more fluid, more confident. I could hear its breathing, wet, ragged sounds that seemed to come from multiple throats. Tommy stumbled again, his face pale from blood loss. The creature seized its opportunity, coiling itself to spring. I turned and threw my hammer with desperate strength, catching it square in the head. The impact sent it sprawling, its body twisting in ways that defied anatomy. We made it to my truck somehow, slamming the doors just as the thing recovered. It hurled itself against the driver's side window, leaving smears of something black and oily on the glass. Its face pressed against the window, and I saw its eyes for the first time. Pale, milky orbs that looked Antigua's and ancient as the stones that had imprisoned it. I gunned the engine, throwing gravel as we fishtailed onto the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the middle of the driveway, its head cocked at an impossible angle, watching us leave. Its mouth was open in what looked horribly like a smile. The emergency room staff didn't ask too many questions about Tommy's injuries, which was a blessing. They wrote it off as a construction accident, though I caught one of the older nurses making the sign of the cross when she saw the wounds. I called the sheriff from the hospital, reporting the bones we'd found but leaving out any mention of what had attacked us. How could I describe something that shouldn't exist? Who would believe me? But someone did. I was walking through the parking lot, heading home to clean up, when Sarah Littlefeather stepped out of the shadows. She was in her 80s, one of the tribe's most respected elders, known for her knowledge of the old stories and traditions. I hadn't seen her in months, not since my grandmother's funeral. "You've seen it," she said. It wasn't a question. I stopped, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Seen what?" "The Pukwugi," she said, the word seeming to darken the air around us. "The hungry one, the thing that lives in the spaces between." "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Sarah's face was grave. "It is very old, older than our people's memory. It feeds on the young, the innocent. Their fear makes them sweeter." She touched my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. Harlan Carruthers thought he could control it, use it. He fed it for years until it took him to. "How do we stop it?" Her expression softened with something like pity. "You freed it from its prison. It will hunt now, hunt until it's satisfied, and it's never satisfied." "There has to be a way," I insisted. She was quiet for a long moment. "There might be," she finally said, "but the price is high. Come to my house tomorrow. I'll tell you what I know." But tomorrow was too late. Tommy disappeared that night. The police found his truck parked at the edge of the woods near his apartment, the engine still warm, his keys in the ignition. His phone was on the seat, showing a missed call from me. The official search began at dawn. They brought in dogs, but the animals wouldn't track. They just whined and pulled back toward their handlers, tails tucked between their legs. I knew they wouldn't find him, not where he'd been taken. I went to Sarah's house, but she was gone too. Her daughter said she'd left before sunrise, heading into the woods with her medicine bag and a grim expression. She hadn't returned. I spent the day gathering what I needed. My hunting rifle, blessed ammunition Sarah had given me years ago, just in case, herbs and medicines from my grandmother's collection. As the sun set, I drove back to the Carruthers house. I knew that's where it would be, where it would take its prey to feed. The house looked different in the twilight, more alive somehow. Shadows moved behind the windows in ways that didn't match the dying light. The air was thick with that metallic smell from the cellar, stronger now, mixed with something worse, something raw and meaty. I could hear it as soon as I stepped out of the truck, not scratching this time, but a wet, rhythmic sound from beneath the house, something being consumed. The cellar door was open when I reached it, swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. The darkness beyond seemed absolute, swallowing the beam of my flashlight like black water. I could still hear the sounds, closer now, punctuated by soft, satisfied growls. I descended the stairs slowly, rifle ready. The space had changed since yesterday. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light that came from nowhere and everywhere. The hole we'd found was larger now, revealing a tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. The creature was waiting for me in the center of the room. It had grown, its body now the size of a bear but still wrong in its proportions. Blood, fresh blood, stained its muzzle and claws. Tommy's dog tags hung from one of its two long fingers. Behind it I saw movement. Sarah Littlefeather, her medicine bag open beside her, drawing symbols on the floor with what looked like ash and blood. Her lips moved in a silent chant. The creature seemed aware of her, but unconcerned, its milky eyes fixed on me. "You cannot have him," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You cannot have any more of us." The thing's mouth opened in that terrible smile, and it spoke, not with sound, but directly into my mind. Words like ice water down my spine. "They are already mine. They have always been mine. This is my place, my feeding ground. Your kind forgot, but I remained." It lunged at me, faster than before, driven by hunger and rage. I fired, the blessed bullet catching it in the chest. The impact knocked it back, black ichor spraying from the wound, but it didn't fall. Instead, it laughed, that horrible sound that was almost human, but completely wrong. Sarah's chanting grew louder, and the symbols she'd drawn began to glow with a pale blue light. The creature noticed now, turning toward her with a snarl. I fired again, hitting it in the leg, forcing its attention back to me. "Your time is done," Sarah called, her voice strong despite her age. "Return to your sleep, Hunger One. Return to the dark." The creature screamed then, a sound that shattered the remaining windows and sent dust raining from the ceiling. It tried to retreat, to return to its tunnel, but the glowing symbols had created a barrier it couldn't cross. I emptied the rest of my magazine into it, each blessed bullet burning like phosphorus where it struck. The thing thrashed and howled, its body beginning to dissolve like ice in summer sun, melting away into nothing but a dark stain on the cellar floor. We found Tommy in one of the deeper tunnels, unconscious but alive. The doctors couldn't explain his survival, just as they couldn't explain the strange marks on his body or the way he sometimes woke screaming about teeth in the darkness. Sarah told me later that the creature had been sealed away by colonial settlers who'd learned of its existence from our people. Harlan Carruthers had found it, thought he could use it to take revenge on the town that had shunned him. Instead, it had used him, fed on his hatred until he was nothing but an empty shell, then fed on the children he helped it capture. The Carruthers house burned down a week later. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but I saw Sarah walking away from the property just before the first flames appeared. Some things need to be purified by fire. Tommy recovered physically at least. The nightmares continued, but he learned to live with them. We both did. We left Greenville, moved up north to a smaller town where the forests are younger and the shadows less deep. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear scratching in the walls. And I wonder if it really died, or if it just went back to sleep, waiting for someone else to wake it. Because that's the thing about hunger. It never really ends. It just waits. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage across the northern Cheyenne Reservation as I drove my weathered Ford pickup down the familiar dirt road. After 8 years in Denver's construction industry, the quiet of the Montana prairie felt almost unsettling. My name is Leon Tallpine, and I'd returned home 3 months ago when my father's diabetes took a turn for the worse. The transition hadn't been easy. Trading steel beams and concrete for horses and open fields meant adjusting to a different rhythm of life. But there was something about being back on ancestral land that felt right, even if the circumstances weren't what I'd hoped for. Dad needed help managing the small horse breeding operation he'd built over the years, and my sister Sarah couldn't handle it alone while working as a nurse in lame deer. That particular evening started like any other. The sun was setting behind the Wolf Mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. I'd spent the afternoon fixing fence posts along the eastern pasture when Sarah called to tell me that Midnight, one of our most reliable mares, hadn't come in with the other horses. "She's never wandered off before," Sarah said, concern evident in her voice. "Dad's worried sick, and you know how his blood pressure gets." I assured her I'd find Midnight before dark. It wasn't unusual for horses to roam. We had nearly 40 acres of grazing land. But Sarah was right about Midnight. The black mare was typically the first one at the gate come feeding time. Looking back, I should have grabbed more than just my jacket before heading out. A flashlight at least, or maybe my rifle. But 8 years in the city had dulled certain instincts. I knew these fields like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Some things change while you're away, and some things were always there, waiting. The tracks weren't hard to follow at first. Midnight's hoofprints led toward the back country, where the flat prairie gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with clusters of ponderosa pine and willow thickets. It was rougher terrain, seldom visited except by the occasional hunter or teenager looking for privacy. As dusk settled in, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath formed small clouds in the failing light, and I began to regret not bringing a flashlight. The moon was rising at least, casting enough light to make out shapes and shadows. I spotted Midnight's dark silhouette just past a dense patch of willows. She stood unnaturally still, facing away from me, her ears pinned back in a way I'd never seen before. I whistled the familiar call we used to bring in the horses, a sound she'd known since she was a foal. She didn't move, didn't even twitch. That's when I noticed she wasn't alone. At first, my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing by fitting it into familiar categories. A wolf, maybe, or a mountain lion, though we hadn't had confirmed sightings of either in years. But as I drew closer, the shape beside Midnight refused to resolve itself into anything natural. It stood nearly as tall as the horse's back, its body a twisted mass of elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles. The thing's skin had a leather-like quality that seemed to absorb what little light there was, stretched too tight over a frame that didn't follow any anatomical logic I knew. But it was the head that made my blood run cold. Imagine a coyote's skull, but wrong, stretched and warped like something viewed through badly curved glass. The jaw extended too far, filled with row upon row of teeth that reminded me of the shark documentaries I used to watch with my nephew. They weren't the teeth of a predator designed to kill quickly. They were meant for something else entirely. The creature hovered over Midnight, its grotesque muzzle grazing her neck with an almost delicate precision. The mare trembled but remained frozen, caught in some kind of paralysis I couldn't understand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave her there. My hand found a rock, about the size of a softball, and without thinking through the consequences, I hurled it as hard as I could. The stone struck the creature's shoulder with a sound like hitting packed clay, and that's when it turned to face me. I've seen things that would make most people uncomfortable. Construction accidents that left men broken and mangled. Car wrecks on I-25 that haunted me for weeks. But nothing prepared me for those eyes. They were black, but not like animal eyes. They were empty in a way that defied description, like looking into holes cut in reality itself. There was intelligence there, but not the kind you find in nature. This was something older, something that understood pain in ways that no living thing should. The creature's movement was what broke me. When it turned, its body didn't flow like muscle and bone should. Instead, it jerked and twisted like a time-lapse video of a spider molting, each limb snapping into new positions with mechanical precision. The sound, God, the sound was like dry branches breaking in slow motion. I ran. Behind me, I heard Midnight's panicked whinny as she finally broke free from whatever hold the creature had on her. Her hoofbeats thundered away in the opposite direction, but I couldn't spare the focus to feel relief. The thing was pursuing me. Have you ever had a nightmare where you're being chased? Where your legs feel like they're moving through molasses, and no matter how fast you run, the thing behind you gets closer and closer. That's what it felt like, except this was real. My lungs burned as I sprinted across the uneven ground, my boots slipping on loose rocks and patches of dry grass. The creature moved with an efficiency that defied its twisted form. I could hear it behind me, not the sound of running, but a series of rapid impacts accompanied by that horrible cracking noise, like it was breaking and reassembling itself with each stride. The sound grew closer with each passing second. My truck was parked near the edge of the tree line, maybe 200 yards ahead. It might as well have been 2 miles. My legs trembled with exhaustion, and the stitch in my side felt like a knife between my ribs. But then I heard it, a wet clicking sound, like someone rapidly opening and closing scissors, coming from just behind my head. I didn't look back. Looking back would have killed me, I'm sure of it. Instead, I forced every ounce of energy into my legs, pushing harder than I ever had before. The truck grew larger in my vision, its familiar outline a beacon of safety in the growing darkness. Just as I reached for the door handle, something struck me from behind. Not a direct hit, but a grazing blow that sent me sprawling against the truck's side. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, but survival instinct took over. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as a massive force crashed into the side of the vehicle. The truck rocked violently on its suspension. Through the window I caught a glimpse of something that my mind still refuses to fully process, a tangle of limbs and angles that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that violated everything I knew about physical space. Then I had the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the road. The radio played country music, the familiar twang serving as an absurd counterpoint to what had just happened. I wanted to call someone, Sarah, the tribal police, anyone. But what would I say? Who would believe me? When I finally pulled into our driveway, I sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The porch light was on, and through the window I could see Dad in his favorite chair, probably worried sick about both me and Midnight. I needed to go inside, to act normal, to find some way to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. But first I forced myself to look at the side of the truck where the thing had hit us. In the yellow light from the porch, I could see long scratches in the paint, deeper than any normal animal could make. And there, caught in one of the deeper gouges, was a small piece of what looked like leather, except it was moving slightly, pulsing like something alive. I grabbed a stick from the ground and carefully scraped it off, watching as it seemed to dissolve into a dark stain that disappeared into the dirt. Only then did I allow myself to go inside. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had all been some sort of hallucination. Maybe I'd been working too hard, or the stress of caring for Dad had finally gotten to me. Midnight had returned home on her own sometime during the night, apparently unharmed but still skittish. When I checked her over, I found no marks or injuries, just a strange, almost oily residue on her neck that wouldn't wash off. Then my cousin Bill called. "Leon, something got into my yard last night," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Took my dog Shadow. There's tracks all around the house. Never seen anything like them." I drove over to Bill's place, my stomach churning with dread. The tracks were there, just as he'd said. Long, deep impressions in the soft earth that looked like someone had pressed twisted machinery into the ground. They led from the broken remains of Bill's fence to a small copse of trees at the edge of his property. We found what was left of Shadow there. I won't describe it in detail. Some things are better left unsaid. But the way the dog had been torn apart, it wasn't the work of any natural predator. The wound showed evidence of those same impossibly arranged teeth I'd seen the night before, and there was that same dark residue on what remained of Shadow's collar. Word spread quickly through the reservation, as it always does. More animals went missing over the next few days, mostly livestock, but also pets and wild creatures. People reported strange sounds in the night, like breaking branches and scraping metal. Some said they saw shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't, while others spoke of a presence that made their horses go crazy with fear. The elders began to talk, sharing stories that hadn't been told openly in generations. My grandmother, Ellen Tall Pine, who rarely spoke of the old ways, called me to her house one evening. She burned sage and cedar, filling her small living room with fragrant smoke before she would even discuss what was happening. "There are things in this world that don't belong to it," she said, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Things that were here before us, before the buffalo, before the grass itself. The old ones called them shadow walkers, beings that exist in the spaces between what is and what should not be." She told me how in times of great suffering or change, these entities could become more active, drawn to the pain and fear of living things. The description she gave matched what I'd seen: the twisted limbs, the wrong angles, the hungry void of its eyes. "But they can be killed," she said, her voice hardening. "They may not belong to this world, but while they're here, they're bound by certain rules. They can bleed, they can die. The problem is surviving long enough to make that happen." A week passed, and the attacks continued. People started traveling in groups, carrying weapons, avoiding being out after dark. The tribal police investigated, but what could they do? There was no protocol for dealing with something like this. I found myself drawn to the river, a place that had always brought me peace. The sound of running water helped drown out the memories of that night, the images that kept me awake long after midnight. But as I sat on the bank watching the current swirl past, I felt that familiar sensation, a wrongness in the air, a pressure behind my eyes that made my teeth ache. This time I was ready, or at least I thought I was. It emerged from the shadows of the cottonwoods, moving with that same impossible grace that haunted my nightmares. In the dying light I could see it more clearly than before. Its body seemed to shift and flow, as if it couldn't quite decide on a single form. But those eyes remained constant, twin voids that promised pain and understanding in equal measure. The creature didn't hesitate this time. It launched itself at me with frightening speed, its jaw unhinging like a snake's to reveal row upon row of those awful teeth. I managed to dive aside, grabbing a fallen branch as I rolled to my feet. The wood felt solid in my hands, giving me a false sense of security that lasted exactly as long as it took for the thing to turn and face me again. We fought there by the river's edge, the sound of rushing water mixing with the creature's inhuman shrieks. The branch connected several times, but it was like hitting concrete. The impacts jarred my arms to the shoulder, and the thing barely seemed to notice. It was toying with me, I realized, learning how I moved, how I fought, how I feared. But that was its mistake. In playing with its food, it got careless. I saw my opening when it lunged again, a jagged rock protruding from the riverbank, its edge sharp enough to draw blood when I grabbed it. As the creature came at me, I drove the stone up into the soft spot just below its jaw, where that twisted neck met its body. The sound it made, I still hear it in my dreams, not a scream, but a frequency that made my vision blur and my nose bleed. Black fluid that moved like mercury poured from the wound as the thing thrashed and convulsed, its limbs bending and snapping in ways that seemed to multiply the number of angles in the world. I didn't stay to watch it die. I ran until I found the road, where a passing truck driver picked me up. He took one look at my blood-covered hands and asked no questions, just drove me straight to the tribal police station. When we returned to the site with a group of warriors, there's no other word for the men and women who volunteered to go back there, we found the creature's body. It had partially melted into a tar-like substance that ate away at the grass and rocks beneath it, but enough remained to confirm what it was. We buried it deep, marking the spot with warnings that only those who know the old ways would recognize. The attacks stopped after that night. Life on the reservation gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be once you know what's really out there. Midnight eventually calmed down, though she never again wandered far from the barn after dark. Dad's health improved enough for him to start telling his own version of what happened, each retelling getting more elaborate than the last. But sometimes, when I'm out alone and the wind blows just right, I catch a scent like old leather and wet clay. And I wonder, was it really the only one of its kind? Or are there more out there, moving in the spaces between what we can see and what we can comprehend, waiting for their chance to step into our world? The thing's body is still there, buried under 6 feet of Montana soil. I check sometimes, just to be sure, because I've learned that some stories aren't just stories, and some truths are better left undisturbed. But if you're ever out on the prairie at night, and you feel something watching you from angles that shouldn't exist, don't look back. Just run. Run as fast as you can and pray you're faster than whatever decides to chase you. The wind howled against the cracked windows of my old truck as I drove down the lonely stretch of highway. A thick fog clung to the road, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I could feel the weight of the letter in my jacket pocket, a reminder of why I was here. Being back near the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota after almost 10 years felt like reopening an old wound. My name's Tawa Nighthawk, and I've spent the last decade working as a private investigator, which wasn't exactly a popular career choice among my people. But I was good at it. It paid the bills, and more importantly, it let me keep my distance from the ghosts of my past. My father used to say I had the spirit of a hawk, always soaring alone above the world. He wasn't wrong. That's probably why I was the only one they could call when things went wrong. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, followed by a frantic call from Pete Runs Deep, an elder I'd known since childhood. His voice had been tight with worry as he told me about my cousin Charlie's disappearance. Charlie had gone hunting in the Badlands a week ago and hadn't returned. The police had already called off the search, writing it off as another case of a hunter getting lost or falling into one of the countless ravines that scarred the landscape. But Pete's voice had held something else, fear. Not just concern for Charlie, but a deeper, more primal fear that made my skin crawl. "There are tracks," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tracks like nothing I've ever seen before." Coming from Pete, those words carried weight. He'd been tracking game in these lands since before I was born. I pulled off the highway onto a dirt road, my headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The Badlands stretched out before me, a maze of sharp rock formations and hidden valleys. The setting sun painted the sky in deep crimsons and purples, turning the rocky spires into jagged shadows that seemed to reach for the darkening heavens. My truck's engine echoed off the canyon walls, as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the fog was getting thicker, clinging to the ground like a living thing. I'd forgotten how quickly night could fall out here, how complete the darkness could be. The coordinates Pete had sent led me to a small camp tucked away in a protected valley. As I pulled up, I could see the glow of a campfire, and Pete's silhouette standing beside it. He'd aged since I'd last seen him, his hair now more silver than black, his face lined with years of sun and wind. But his eyes were still sharp, still held that fierce warrior spirit I remembered from my youth. "You made it," he said, offering me a steaming cup of coffee as I approached the fire. The smell of wood smoke and pine needles filled the air, bringing back memories of countless nights spent around similar fires in my younger days. "Yeah," I replied, taking the cup and letting its warmth seep into my cold hands. "Any news?" Pete's face darkened as he shook his head. "Nothing good. Found more tracks today heading deeper into the bad country, and—" He hesitated, looking into the fire. "There's something else, something I didn't want to say over the phone." I waited, knowing Pete well enough to know he'd speak when ready. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. "Remember the stories my grandmother used to tell about the old ones, the spirits that walked these lands before the white man came?" He looked up at me, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I always thought they were just stories, meant to keep children from wandering too far. But these tracks—" He shook his head again. "They're not natural, Tawa. Not animal, not human. Something else." I took a long sip of coffee, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. "Pete, you know as well as I do that those are just stories. There has to be a rational explanation." "Does there?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, carefully unfolding it. It was a rough sketch of a footprint, but like nothing I'd ever seen before. The proportions were all wrong, too long, too deep, with what looked like massive claw marks at the ends of unnaturally long toes. "Found these about 2 miles from where Charlie's camp was. They're fresh, maybe a day old, and they're big, Tawa. Whatever made these stands at least 8 feet tall." I studied the sketch, trying to make sense of it. Could be a bear, I thought. But even as the idea formed, I knew it was wrong. Bear tracks were distinctive, and these were something else entirely. The claw marks alone were unlike anything I'd seen in my years of tracking. "There's more," Pete continued, his voice dropping lower. "The night before Charlie disappeared, I heard something, a sound like—" He struggled for words. "Like a woman crying, but not quite. It came from the direction of his camp. I tried to radio him, but there was nothing but static. By the time I got there the next morning, he was gone. His tent was still there, his gear scattered around like he'd left in a hurry. But no blood, no signs of a struggle, just those tracks leading off into the Badlands." The wind picked up, causing the fire to dance wildly. In the distance, something howled, probably a coyote, but the sound seemed different somehow, more hollow. Pete and I both turned toward it instinctively. "We'll start at first light," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Show me where you found the tracks." Pete nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Be careful what you wish for, Tawa. Some things are better left unfound." As I settled into my sleeping bag that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness seemed alive somehow, moving and shifting just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, just the wind moving through the rocky formations that surrounded us. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but remember the stories Pete's grandmother used to tell, stories of ancient spirits that stalked these lands, of creatures that were neither man nor beast but something in between, stories that, in the darkness of the Badlands, didn't seem quite so impossible anymore. Dawn broke over the Badlands with all the warmth of a corpse's smile. The fog had settled into the valleys overnight, turning the landscape into a maze of gray shadows and hidden depths. Pete and I started early, loading our packs with essential gear rope, first aid supplies, extra ammunition. The weight of my .30.06 rifle felt reassuring against my shoulder, though a nagging voice in my head wondered if bullets would be enough for whatever had made those tracks. Charlie's camp was about 3 miles northeast, Pete said, checking his compass. Rough country between here and there, lots of places to get lost, or to hide. We moved in silence through the early morning mist. The Badlands were treacherous even in good conditions, loose shale that could give way under your feet, deep crevices hidden by overgrown sage, rattlesnakes warming themselves on sun-heated rocks. But in this fog, every step required careful consideration. About an hour into our hike, Pete held up his hand, freezing in place. I followed his gaze to a patch of disturbed earth ahead. The tracks were there, just as he'd drawn them, massive impressions in the soft soil, each one nearly 2 feet long. But seeing them in person was different from looking at a sketch. There was something wrong about them, something that made my stomach turn. "Look at the depth," Pete whispered, kneeling beside one of the prints. "Whatever made these weighs at least 500 pounds, but see how the front of the print is deeper than the heel?" He traced the outline with his finger. "It walks on its toes like a predator." I studied the surrounding area, noting how the tracks moved through the landscape. "It's hunting," I said, the realization sending a chill down my spine. "See how it stays close to the rock walls, using them for cover? This isn't random movement. It's stalking something. Or someone, I thought, but didn't say." We followed the trail for another mile, the fog gradually lifting as the sun climbed higher. The tracks led us into increasingly rough terrain, winding through narrow canyons where the walls rose so high they blocked out most of the daylight. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying a musty odor that reminded me of decay. Then we found the first body. It was wedged in a narrow crevice, partially hidden by tumbled rocks. If not for the flies, we might have missed it entirely. The victim was male, probably in his 40s, dressed in expensive hiking gear. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his body torn apart with savage violence. "Mountain lion?" I suggested, though I knew better. The wounds were all wrong, too large, too deliberate. Mountain lions killed efficiently, going for the throat. This was something else entirely. Pete shook his head slowly. "This is fresh, maybe 2 days old. See how the blood hasn't fully dried?" He pointed to dark stains on the rocks. "And look at these marks. Whatever did this played with him first. Tortured him." I took photos with my phone, careful to document everything. Part of me, the investigator part, tried to stay detached, to treat this like any other case. But there was something deeply personal about this killing, something that spoke to primal fears buried deep in human DNA. "We should go back," Pete said quietly, "get the authorities involved." "You know they won't come," I replied. "They've already written this off as animal attacks or accidents. Besides," I checked my phone, no signal, as expected. Charlie might still be alive out there. Pete's expression told me he didn't share my optimism, but he nodded anyway. We marked the location on our GPS and continued following the tracks. The sun was directly overhead when we reached Charlie's camp, or what was left of it. The site was a mess tent, shredded, supplies scattered across the ground. Charlie's rifle lay broken beside a boulder, the barrel bent at an impossible angle. But it was the blood that caught my attention, or rather the lack of it. No body, I noted, scanning the area. And these supplies, they're not random. Look how they're scattered in a rough line leading that way. I pointed toward a dark opening in the canyon wall, like he was running, dropping things as he went. Pete was examining the ground near the tent. "These tracks are different from the others, smaller but similar pattern. There's more than one of them, Tawa." The implication hit me like a physical blow. We weren't dealing with a single predator, but a pack, and they were herding their prey. A sound echoed through the canyon then, a long, keening wail that was neither human nor animal. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the rock walls until it was impossible to pinpoint its source. Pete and I both instinctively raised our rifles, moving so we were back to back. "That sound," Pete's voice was barely audible. "That's what I heard the night Charlie disappeared." The wail came again, closer this time, and with it, the sound of loose rocks sliding somewhere above us. Something was moving up there, something big. "The cave," I whispered. "It's our only choice." Pete nodded grimly. We moved toward the dark opening, keeping our eyes on the canyon walls. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I could hear movement all around us. The soft scrape of claws on stone, the quiet huffing of large bodies moving through narrow spaces. They were hurting us too, I realized, just like they'd herded Charlie, and we were walking right into their trap. The cave mouth gaped before us like an open wound in the earth. Our flashlight beams seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The air coming from the opening was cold and damp, carrying that same decay smell we'd noticed earlier, but stronger now. "We should mark our path," I said, pulling a piece of surveyor's tape from my pack. "These cave systems can go on for miles." I tied the bright orange strip to a protruding rock near the entrance. It fluttered in the slight breeze coming from deeper in the cave like something breathing. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing us to move single file. The walls were smooth in places, worn down by centuries of water flow, but elsewhere they were jagged with sharp outcroppings that seemed to reach for us as we passed. Our boots crunched on loose gravel, each sound echoing deep into the darkness. "Look," Pete whispered, his flashlight beam highlighting something on the floor. It was Charlie's backpack, torn and covered in dust. Next to it lay his satellite phone, smashed beyond repair. The screen was cracked, but the time and date were still visible, 2:17 a.m. 5 days ago. I picked up the phone, turning it over in my hands. He made it at least this far. A scuffling sound echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by what sounded like claws scraping on stone. Pete and I froze, our lights darting around the passage. For a moment I thought I saw something move in the darkness beyond our beams, a shadow darker than the surrounding blackness, flowing like liquid along the cave wall. "We're not alone in here," Pete said softly. We pressed on, moving deeper into the cave system. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes widening into larger chambers, other times narrowing so much we had to turn sideways to squeeze through. I tried to keep track of our route: second left, straight past 2 right turns, down a sloping passage. But the cave's geography was confusing, disorienting. The temperature dropped steadily as we descended. Our breath began to fog in front of us, and condensation dripped from the ceiling. The walls were slick with moisture, gleaming in our flashlight beams like wet skin. Then we found the bones. They were scattered across the floor of a large chamber, some old and yellowed, others disturbingly fresh. Most were animal remains, deer, coyotes, mountain lions, but mixed among them were things that could only be human. A skull stared up at us from a pile of debris, its empty sockets seeming to follow our movements. "Jesus," Pete breathed, his voice shaking. "This is their larder, where they store their food." I knelt to examine one of the fresher bones. The marks on it were distinctive, long, deep scoring from massive claws, and teeth marks that didn't match any predator I knew. But it was the deliberate arrangement that disturbed me most. These weren't just scattered remains, they were organized, sorted by size and type. This wasn't just animal behavior. A sound echoed through the chamber then, a wet, rasping cough that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Pete's flashlight beam darted to a dark opening high in the chamber wall. For just a moment I saw something move, a pale, elongated limb, too long to be human, with joints that bent the wrong way. "Move," I hissed, pushing Pete toward another passage. "Now!" We ran, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind us I could hear movement, the sound of multiple heavy bodies dropping to the chamber floor, the click of claws on stone. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. The passage ahead split in two. Without time to think, I grabbed Pete's arm and yanked him toward the left fork. The ceiling dropped lower here, forcing us to crouch as we ran. My pack scraped against the rock above, sending small cascades of pebbles pattering to the floor. Then Pete's flashlight caught something ahead that made us both stop dead in our tracks. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the last, and there, propped against the far wall, was Charlie. He was alive. But as we got closer, I almost wished he wasn't. His clothes were in tatters, his skin covered in cuts and bruises. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at something we couldn't see. His lips moved constantly, forming words without sound. "Charlie?" Pete moved toward him slowly. "Charlie, it's Pete. We're here to get you out." Charlie's eyes snapped to focus on us, and a sound came from his throat, a high, keening whimper that made my skin crawl. "You can't be here," he whispered. "They'll come back. They always come back." Who, Charlie? I asked, keeping my voice low. What are they? He shook his head violently. Not who, what? They're not natural, not right. They walk like men sometimes, but they're not. Their faces. He broke off, shuddering. They kept me alive to watch, to learn. They're smart, so smart they want to understand us. A scraping sound echoed from the passage behind us. Charlie's eyes widened in terror. They're coming, he whimpered. Oh God, they're coming. I swung my flashlight toward the passage entrance. In its beam, I caught a glimpse of something that defied explanation. A pale, elongated figure crouched in the opening, its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its face was a nightmare of misshapen features, somewhere between human and animal, with eyes that reflected our light like mirrors. Then the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. In the darkness, every sound became magnified. The drip of water from the cave ceiling, Charlie's ragged breathing, the soft click of claws on stone growing closer. I fumbled with my flashlight, hitting it against my palm, but it remained stubbornly dark. Pete's light had died too. They don't like light, Charlie whispered, but they don't need it. They can see us. They can always see us. I unslung my rifle, pressing my back against the cold cave wall. The darkness was absolute, but I could sense movement, something large shifting in the passage ahead of us. The air grew colder, carrying that rotten smell that seemed to follow these creatures. Pete, I said quietly, get Charlie up. We need to move. There's another way, Charlie said, his voice trembling. Through the back of the chamber, it leads up, to the surface. I found it, but I couldn't. They wouldn't let me. A sound came from the darkness then, a low, rattling hiss that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. It was answered by another, then another. They were surrounding us. Pete had managed to get Charlie to his feet. I could hear them shuffling toward the back of the chamber. My hand tightened on my rifle, though I knew firing blind would be worse than useless. The creatures would know exactly where we were, and in this enclosed space the muzzle flash would blind us completely. Something brushed against my shoulder, a long, cold limb that withdrew the instant I flinched away. They were toying with us, I realized, like they had toyed with Charlie, like they had toyed with the man we found in the canyon. Move toward my voice, I said to Pete and Charlie. Slowly, keep your hand on the wall. I began edging along the wall, keeping the rifle pointed toward where I'd last heard the creatures. The stone was slick under my fingers, covered in some kind of slime that made my stomach turn. Behind me, I could hear Pete guiding Charlie, their footsteps echoing in the chamber. A screech cut through the darkness, high, piercing, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was answered by more screeches, the sound bouncing off the cave walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then came the sound of running heavy bodies moving fast across the chamber floor. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of stealth. We crashed through the darkness, guided only by touch and desperation. Charlie knew the way. He took the lead, pulling Pete along with him. I brought up the rear, running backward every few steps, though I knew it was pointless. If they wanted to take us, they could. The passage climbed steeply, the floor rough and treacherous under our feet. I could hear the creatures behind us, their movements quick and sure in the darkness. They were herding us again, I realized, just like they had herded Charlie, just like they had probably herded countless others before us. "There's light ahead," Pete called out, and he was right. A faint, grayish glow was visible at the end of the passage, daylight filtering down from above. We reached a vertical shaft, maybe 20 feet high. Roots and vines hung down from the opening above, and a thin shaft of daylight illuminated floating dust motes. Hope surged through me. We were close. Then Charlie screamed. I spun around just as Pete's backup flashlight sputtered to life, revealing a scene from a nightmare. One of the creatures had Charlie by the leg, its long, pale fingers wrapped around his ankle. In the dim light, I could finally see it clearly, and I wished I couldn't. It was tall, maybe 8 feet when fully upright, with a body that seemed to be made of too many joints, all of them bending in wrong directions. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over protruding bones. But its face was the worst part. It was almost human, but twisted, distorted, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face without ever having seen one. Its eyes were huge, pupilless, reflecting the light like mirrors. I raised my rifle and fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but the creature released Charlie, shrieking as black blood sprayed from its shoulder. More shapes moved in the darkness behind it, at least 3 more creatures, maybe more. "Climb!" I shouted, firing again to keep them back. "Now!" Pete helped Charlie onto the first ledge, then started climbing himself. I kept firing, each muzzle flash providing a strobe-like glimpse of pale bodies and reaching limbs. They were being cautious now, staying just at the edge of the light. "Tawa!" Pete called from above. "Come on!" I backed toward the wall, keeping my rifle trained on the darkness. The creatures moved with me, always just out of clear sight. They could have rushed me. There were enough of them to overwhelm me easily. But they held back, watching, studying. I found the first handhold and began to climb, awkward with the rifle slung across my back. Above me, Pete and Charlie were almost at the top. Pale hands reached for my boots, just missing as I pulled myself higher. Then my handhold crumbled. I fell maybe 10 feet, landing hard on the cave floor. Pain shot through my left ankle, not broken but sprained badly. The creatures moved closer, their pale forms visible now in the dim light from above. They moved in that strange, fluid way, like their bones were liquid. "Tawa!" Pete's voice echoed down the shaft. He was silhouetted against the opening above, raising his rifle. "No!" I shouted. "Get Charlie out! Go!" One of the creatures reached for me, its long fingers splayed. I raised my rifle and fired point-blank into its chest. Black blood sprayed across my face, burning like acid. The creature stumbled back, making that awful screeching sound. But there were more, so many more. My world narrowed to the sound of my heartbeat and the creatures surrounding me. Through the pain and terror, my investigator's mind was still working, still observing. Their movements were coordinated, intelligent. They weren't just animals. They were working together, communicating through those horrible screeching sounds. I had 4 rounds left in my rifle. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Then I noticed something else. They were keeping their distance from my rifle, even when they had clear opportunities to grab me. The muzzle flash hurt them, I realized. Their eyes were adapted for darkness, sensitive enough to see in the pitch black of the caves. Which meant I reached into my jacket pocket with my free hand, fingers closing around the emergency flare I always carried. One chance. The nearest creature lunged forward, its elongated arms reaching for me. I fired the rifle again, making it flinch back. Then I struck the flare. Brilliant red light exploded through the chamber. The effect was immediate and devastating. The creatures screamed, not their usual screeching, but sounds of genuine pain. They recoiled, covering their huge eyes with pale hands, retreating into the shadows. I forced myself to my feet, using the rifle as a crutch. My ankle screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept me moving. The flare would only last a few minutes. I had to climb, now. The creatures stayed back, hissing and writhing in the shadows as I dragged myself up the shaft. Every movement was agony, but the alternative was worse. Much worse. I could hear Pete shouting encouragement from above, see his hands reaching down to help. Just as the flare began to sputter out, Pete and Charlie pulled me through the opening into blessed daylight. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, as evening sunlight painted the sky in shades of red and gold. The authorities finally came, of course, once we got back to civilization. They found the body of the hiker we'd discovered, and others too, but they never found the creatures. The cave system was extensive, stretching for miles under the Badlands, with hundreds of unexplored passages and chambers. Charlie recovered, physically at least. The psychological scars would take longer to heal. He told us what had happened during his 5 days in the darkness, how the creatures had studied him, mimicked his movements, tried to understand him. They were intelligent, he said, maybe as intelligent as humans. But it was a cold intelligence, alien and predatory. Research turned up other stories. Decades of disappearances in the Badlands, bodies found with strange marks, unusual tracks that couldn't be identified. Native stories of creatures that lived in the deep places of the earth, watching, learning, hunting. The authorities blamed mountain lions, bears, exposure, anything but the truth. My official report was clinical, detached, missing hunter located, evidence of predator activity, multiple casualties, case closed. But late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I remember those pale faces in the darkness, those eyes that reflected our light like mirrors. I remember how they moved, how they thought, how they hunted. Pete was right about one thing. There are old stories, ancient stories about things that lived in these lands long before humans came. Things that watched us arrive, watched us build our cities and roads, watched us take over their hunting grounds. Things that learned to stay hidden but never stopped watching, never stopped hunting. A letter arrived last week. Another disappearance. Another desperate family looking for answers. Another trip into the dark places where civilized maps end and ancient territories begin. I should turn it down. I know I should. But I can't stop thinking about those creatures studying us, learning from us, adapting, evolving. How many more are out there? How long have they been watching us? What are they planning? The Badlands are vast and they hide their secrets well. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind carries strange sounds across the empty spaces, I wonder if we're still the hunters, or if we've become the prey. I tell myself the creatures I encountered were some kind of unknown species, something that evolved in isolation in the cave systems of the Badlands. It's a rational explanation, a scientific one. But late at night, when I hear something moving in the shadows, I remember Charlie's words. They want to understand us. And I wonder, what happens when they finally do? The mist clung to the branches of the Sitka spruces like spider silk, turning the Hoh rainforest into a maze of gray shadows. I adjusted the straps of my well-worn backpack, feeling the familiar weight settle against my spine as I waited for my group to gather at the trailhead. My name is Nashoba Blackfeather, and I've spent most of my life in these woods. As a member of the Yakama Nation, I grew up understanding that these forests weren't just trees and dirt. They were living, breathing entities that demanded respect. The morning air was crisp, carrying the damp earthiness that's unique to the Olympic Peninsula. I watched as my clients for the day, two couples from Seattle, climbed out of their rental SUV, their expensive outdoor gear still creased and pristine. They were the type I saw often, urban professionals seeking a taste of wilderness adventure without truly understanding what that meant. "Morning, folks," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, the same tone I'd used to guide countless groups before. "I'm Nashoba, but most people just call me Steady Nashoba." I noticed how they glanced at my weathered face, taking in my traditional braids and the eagle feather I always wore. Their eyes held that familiar mix of curiosity and uncertainty I'd grown used to over the years. Jenna and Kyle Thompson introduced themselves first, both software engineers from Capitol Hill. They had that eager energy of people who spent too much time indoors. Behind them, Brian and Emily Chen were more reserved, especially Emily, who kept glancing nervously at the dense forest around us. "Before we head out, let's go over some basics," I said, falling into my usual routine. "This isn't your average nature walk. The Hoh rainforest is older than any building in Seattle, older than the first European settlers. It deserves our respect." I paused, making eye contact with each of them. "Stay close, follow my lead, and most importantly, listen. The forest speaks if you know how to hear it." I saw Kyle suppress a smile, probably thinking I was playing up the mystical Native American angle. I was used to that too. But I wasn't trying to be mystical, just practical. These woods had taught me hard lessons over the years, and I'd learned to pay attention to their warnings. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I first noticed something was off. The trail we were following wasn't on any tourist map. It was one of my special routes, reserved for groups who wanted something more authentic than the usual guided experience. The canopy above was so thick that only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated, creating pools of golden light on the forest floor. "How much further until we reach the viewpoint?" Jenna asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. She'd been enthusiastic at first, but the terrain was more challenging than she'd expected. "Another hour, give or take," I replied, but my attention was elsewhere. The forest had gone quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a calm day, but the heavy silence that comes before a storm. No birds called, no squirrels rustled through the branches. Even the ever-present sound of wind in the canopy had died away. I'd grown up hearing the old stories from my grandmother, tales of things that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, things that predated our people. I'd always taken them as lessons wrapped in mythology, ways to teach respect for the wilderness. But in that moment, with the unnatural silence pressing in around us, those stories felt uncomfortably real. Brian caught up to me, his breathing slightly labored. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. He'd been watching me, I realized, and had noticed my unease. "Just checking our route," I lied, not wanting to alarm them unnecessarily. But I'd been guiding these woods for 15 years, and I'd never felt anything quite like this. The air felt wrong, heavy and thick, like breathing through a wet blanket. Emily had stopped a few yards back, adjusting her bootlaces. "Does anyone else smell that?" she asked suddenly. "Like something rotting?" I did smell it, a subtle but distinct odor of decay, out of place in the clean forest air. It reminded me of the time I'd found a dead elk, partially decomposed, during a solo hike. But this smell was different, more pungent, almost metallic. "Probably just some fungus," Kyle suggested, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is a rainforest, after all." I nodded, but my hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at my belt, a habit born from years of wilderness experience. "Let's keep moving," I said. "We want to reach the viewpoint before the afternoon fog rolls in." The forest grew denser as we pushed deeper into the wilderness. The trees here were ancient giants, their trunks wider than cars, their bark thick and deeply furrowed. Moss hung in long curtains from the branches, creating a ghostly atmosphere in the filtered light. "Hey, Neshoba," Jenna called out, pointing ahead. "Is that clearing safe for a break? My feet are killing me." I looked where she was pointing. Through the trees I could see a small open space, maybe 30 feet across, where a fallen giant had created a natural break in the canopy. Under normal circumstances it would have been an ideal rest spot, but something about it made my skin crawl. The clearing was too perfectly circular, the grass too uniformly short. In 15 years of guiding I never noticed it before, which was impossible. I knew every inch of these trails. Yet here it was, like it had been waiting for us. "Sure," I heard myself say, even as every instinct screamed against it, "but let's make it quick." We entered the clearing, and the atmosphere changed immediately. The air was noticeably colder, and that rotting smell Emily had noticed earlier was stronger here. The others didn't seem to notice, dropping their packs and settling onto fallen logs with visible relief. I remained standing, scanning the tree line. The silence that had been bothering me earlier was absolute now. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the clearing was wrapped in an invisible barrier that dampened all sound. "This is nice," Kyle said, pulling out his water bottle. "Much better than our usual weekend hikes around Tiger Mountain." Emily wasn't so relaxed. She sat close to Brian, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. She was feeling it too, I realized, that primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. That's when we heard it, the snap of branches, loud and deliberate, from the darkness beyond the clearing's edge. Everyone froze, conversations dying mid-sentence. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was moving through the underbrush, something big enough to break thick branches with casual force. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. "What is that?" Jenna whispered, her voice tight with fear. "A bear?" I shook my head slowly. Bears made noise when they moved, crashing through the undergrowth with little concern for stealth. This was different. The movements were too deliberate, too calculated. Then I saw it, or rather I saw what it did to the forest as it moved. The mist seemed to part around something large and dark, the ferns and branches bending away from an unseen presence. Whatever it was staying just out of clear sight, using the shadows and fog like camouflage. "Everyone up," I said quietly but firmly. "Move together, slowly, head back the way we came." They obeyed without question, the tension in my voice finally breaking through their urban comfort. We began to move as a group, but we'd only taken a few steps when the thing in the shadows decided to show itself. It emerged from the mist like a nightmare taking physical form. My first thought was that it was a bear, but that thought died as soon as it fully revealed itself. It was roughly the size of a moose, but its proportions were all wrong. Its body was covered in dark matted fur that seemed to absorb the light around it. The fur wasn't dry, it glistened wetly, as if the creature had just emerged from some underground pool. Its limbs were what drew my attention first, long and powerful but jointed in ways that seemed impossible. They reminded me of a spider's legs, bent and angular, allowing it to move with an unnatural grace despite its massive size. But it was the head that made my blood run cold. It had a vaguely canine shape, but stretched and distorted, like something had grabbed a wolf's skull and pulled it into a grotesque new form. The jaw was too long, filled with irregular teeth that jutted out at various angles. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. They were intelligent, calculating, and utterly alien. "Run," I whispered, then louder, "Run!" The spell broke and chaos erupted. The creature let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a roar or a growl, but a high, keening noise that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my skull. We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. "Stay together," I shouted, but panic had already taken hold. Kyle and Jenna veered off to the right, while Brian and Emily stayed close to me. I could hear the creature moving parallel to us, its steady pace more terrifying than any full-speed chase would have been. It was toying with us. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches whipping at our faces, roots reaching up to tangle our feet. I could hear Kyle and Jenna somewhere to our right, their panicked breathing and crashing footsteps growing fainter. Then came the scream, high and terrified, cut off with horrible abruptness. "Jenna!" Kyle's voice, distant and desperate. "Jenna! Keep running," I gasped to Brian and Emily. "Don't stop." We stumbled across a small creek, the water cold enough to shock some clarity back into our panic-fogged minds. I pulled them to a stop, knowing we couldn't keep running blindly. "The ridge," I panted, pointing to a steep incline ahead. "We need to get to high ground." But as we started to climb, Brian's foot caught in a root and he went down hard. The crack of his ankle breaking was audible even over our labored breathing. "Leave me," he gasped, face white with pain. "I'll only slow you down." Emily was already shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no." That's when we heard it again, that wet, sliding sound of the creature moving through the undergrowth. It was closer now, much closer. I grabbed a fallen branch, thick and heavy, the best weapon I could find. "Emily, help Brian up. Stay behind me." The creature emerged from the shadows, and I saw with horror that its fur was now slick with fresh blood. It moved with that same terrible grace, its head swaying slightly as it regarded us with those intelligent, malevolent eyes. I didn't think, I just acted. As it lunged forward, I swung the branch with every ounce of strength I had, connecting solidly with its head. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms and the branch shattered. The creature staggered back, more surprised than hurt. It made that keening sound again, but this time it held a note of what almost sounded like pleasure. It was enjoying this. "Go," I shouted to Emily and Brian. "Up the ridge, now." They scrambled upward, Brian hobbling and gasping in pain. I kept my eyes on the creature, backing up slowly. It paced back and forth, watching me with that terrible intelligence. Then it lunged again. I rolled to the side, feeling the wind of its passage as massive claws swept through the space where I'd been standing. The move took me closer to the ridge, and I scrambled backward, half climbing, half crawling up the steep incline. The creature followed to the base of the ridge, then stopped. It stood there, swaying slightly, watching us with those awful eyes. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and melted back into the forest shadows. We made it to the ranger station just as darkness was falling. The rangers took one look at our blood-streaked, terror-stricken faces and immediately called for help. Soon the station was swarming with emergency personnel and law enforcement. I told them everything, every detail still crystal clear in my mind. To their credit, they took it seriously. The search parties went out that night and continued for weeks afterward. They found Kyle's body first, or what was left of it. The official report listed it as a bear attack, but I saw the faces of the search team when they came back. They'd seen something out there that didn't fit any explanation they were comfortable with. Jenna's body was never found. Just scattered pieces of clothing, a broken camera, and strange tracks that the wildlife experts couldn't identify. The papers called it a tragic hiking accident, and eventually the story faded from the news. Brian's ankle healed, but he and Emily moved away from Seattle shortly after. They couldn't stand being close to the mountains anymore. I don't blame them. That was 3 years ago. I haven't guided since then. I still live near the forest, but I don't go deep into the woods anymore. The locals have noticed changes, more missing pets, strange sounds in the night, livestock found torn apart in ways that don't match any known predator. The rangers have closed off that section of the forest, citing environmental concerns. But I know the truth. That thing is still out there, whatever it is. Sometimes on cold, misty nights, I hear that keening cry echoing from the depths of the forest. The elders of my tribe have their own theories. They speak of ancient beings that lived here long before humans walked these lands, creatures that were neither animal nor spirit, but something in between. They say these beings sleep for centuries at a time, waking only when they hunger. I've started writing down everything I remember about that day, every detail about the creature. Not for publication or publicity, I want no part of that. But as a warning, because I know that somewhere in those woods, in the deepest shadows where the mist never lifts, that thing is waiting, watching, hungry, and sooner or later it will wake again. My name's Abe Running Wolf, and I've spent 42 years on the Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana. Out here, the mountains don't care about your plans or your fears. They stand silent, ancient witnesses to everything that unfolds in their shadow. I've tracked elk through blizzards, faced down grizzlies, and survived things that would sound like tall tales to outsiders. But what happened to Ricky James? That's different. That's the kind of story that makes even the oldest members of our tribe fall silent. I first met Ricky in second grade, when his family moved to the reservation for his father's job at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Being one of the few non-native kids in school, he could have had it rough. But Ricky had this way about him, genuine, straightforward, the kind of person who could diffuse tension with a self-deprecating joke and a crooked smile. By high school, he was as much a part of the community as anyone born here. We bonded over hunting. His father wasn't the outdoors type, so I taught him everything I knew, passing on the skills my grandfather had drilled into me since I could walk. Ricky took to it naturally, developing the patience and respect for the land that separates real hunters from tourists with rifles. Over 25 years, we must have tracked game through every valley and ridge within 50 miles of the reservation. That's why when Ricky didn't come home from a solo hunting trip 3 days ago, I knew something was wrong. Ricky wasn't some weekend warrior who'd get turned around in the woods. He knew these mountains like the back of his hand, knew every game trail and creek bed. More importantly, he had ironclad habits. Always left a detailed plan with his wife Sarah, always checked in on his satellite phone every evening, always kept to his timeline. Sarah called me on the second day, worry creasing her voice. "He's not answering his phone, Abe. The battery might be dead, but—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Ricky was methodical about keeping his gear charged and ready. If his phone was dead, it wasn't because he'd forgotten to charge it. I tried to reassure her, but my own unease was growing. "Have you called the sheriff? They said they can't start an official search until he's been missing 72 hours. The frustration in her voice was palpable. "They think he's just camping. Maybe got caught up tracking something." "That's not Ricky," I said, voicing what we both knew. "Look, let me make some calls. I'll get a few guys together. We'll start looking first thing tomorrow." That night, I barely slept. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, in a way I couldn't articulate. The wind outside my window carried an unfamiliar note, and the shadows seemed deeper than usual. I told myself I was being superstitious, letting old stories get to me. Growing up on the reservation, you hear all kinds of tales about things that lurk in the dark places of the world. My grandfather used to say that the old spirits never left these lands. They just learned to hide better from modern eyes. By sunrise, I'd assembled a small search party. Noah Yellowknife, a former Marine who now worked as a tribal police officer, and Jimmy Gray Fox, who'd grown up with Ricky and me. Both were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the terrain. More importantly, they were level-headed and wouldn't panic if things got rough. We met at my house before dawn, checking our gear by the light of my porch lamp. The morning air was thick with moisture, promising rain later. Noah methodically went through his pack, double-checking emergency supplies and first aid kit. Jimmy was quieter than usual, his normally jovial face set in worried lines. "We'll start at his usual hunting grounds," I said, spreading out a topographical map on my truck's hood. Sarah said he was planning to check some spots along Badger Creek, maybe push up into the higher country if he didn't find anything. Noah traced the creek's path with his finger. That's a lot of ground to cover. You sure we shouldn't wait for the sheriff's department? I shook my head. Every hour we wait is another hour something bad could be happening to Ricky. Besides, we know this country better than any search and rescue team they'll send up from Great Falls. Jimmy nodded, adjusting the rifle sling on his shoulder. Abe's right. If Ricky's hurt out there, time matters. What none of us said was the other possibility, that we might already be too late. The mountains can kill in 100 different ways, and that's not counting the four-legged predators that call them home. But Ricky was smart, experienced. He wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks. As we loaded into my truck, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in shades of gray. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks lost in low clouds. A raven watched us from a power line, its harsh cry following us as we pulled away from my house and headed for the back country. None of us knew then that we were driving toward something worse than any of us could imagine, something that would change our understanding of the world forever, something that had already taken Ricky and was waiting for more prey to wander into its domain. The logging road that led to Ricky's usual hunting grounds wasn't much more than a dirt track, rutted and washboarded from spring runoff. My truck bounced and swayed as we pushed deeper into the forest, the thick canopy of lodgepole pines blocking out most of the morning light. The air coming through the open windows carried the sharp scent of pine sap and wet earth. But there was something else beneath it, a subtle wrongness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jimmy noticed it too. "Something's off," he said from the back seat. "Listen." We all fell silent, straining our ears. That's when it hit me. The forest was too quiet. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels. None of the normal background noise you expect in these woods. Just the crunch of tires on gravel and the whisper of wind through the trees. Noah shifted in his seat, his hand unconsciously moving closer to the pistol on his hip. Could be a predator in the area, bear maybe, or a mountain lion. Maybe, I said, but I didn't believe it. I'd been in these woods with predators around plenty of times. This felt different, wrong. We found Ricky's truck about 6 miles in, pulled off the road near a game trail he'd often used. It sat empty, a thin layer of dust and pine needles covering the hood. The driver's door was closed but unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. His hunting pack lay on the passenger seat, untouched. "This doesn't make sense," Jimmy said, examining the ground around the vehicle. "Look at these tracks." He got out, walked to the back of the truck, then... He trailed off, squinting at the dirt. I knew what he meant. The tracks simply stopped, as if Ricky had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication he'd been dragged away, just footprints that ended abruptly at the truck's tailgate. Noah was examining the tree line with his binoculars. No blood, no torn clothing. If it was a predator, there'd be signs. I popped the truck's hood, checking the engine. Everything looked normal, no mechanical issues that would have stranded him here. The gas tank was nearly full. His rifle was still in its case behind the seat, unloaded. That detail made my stomach clench. Ricky never went into the woods unarmed, not even for a short scouting trip. "We should split up," I said, though everything in me screamed it was a bad idea. "Cover more ground, stay within radio range, check in every 15 minutes. Anything looks off, anything at all, you call it in." Noah and Jimmy nodded, but I could see the tension in their faces. They felt it too, the wrongness in the air, the sense that we were being watched by something hidden in the shadows of the forest. We each took a different direction, Noah heading north along the creek, Jimmy working his way up the ridge to the east, and me following the game trail west. The wet ground made tracking easier, but there were no fresh signs of human passage, just deer tracks, a few elk prints, and the occasional rabbit trail. The silence grew deeper as I moved away from the road. The trees seemed to close in, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning light into ghostly beams. The air grew thick with moisture, making it hard to breathe. Every few steps I had to stop and listen, trying to pierce the unnatural quiet. About half a mile in, I found the first real sign that something was wrong. A patch of moss had been torn from a fallen log, recently enough that the exposed wood was still damp. Next to it, deep gouges scarred the log's surface. claw marks, but unlike any I'd seen before. Too large for a bear, too deep for a mountain lion. The spacing was all wrong, suggesting something with fingers rather than paws. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Abe?" It was Jimmy, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this. I'm about 600 yards up the ridge, near that old lightning-struck pine." "What did you find?" There was a long pause. You need to see it. Both of you." Noah acknowledged he was on his way, and I started picking my way up the slope toward Jimmy's position. The ground was treacherous, slick with wet leaves and hidden roots. Twice I nearly fell, catching myself on tree trunks. Each time my hands came away covered in a strange, sticky substance that wasn't sap or moss. It was clear, like thick saliva, and seemed to evaporate quickly in the air. I found Jimmy standing at the base of a massive dead pine, its top shattered by some long-ago lightning strike. He was staring at something on the ground, his face pale beneath his natural tan. Noah arrived a moment later, breathing heavily from the climb. "Look," Jimmy said, pointing to a depression in the ground. At first it looked like a normal game bed, the kind of place where deer might rest, but as I got closer I realized the dimensions were all wrong. The depression was too large, too deliberately shaped, and the ground inside it was covered in that same clear, sticky substance I'd found on the trees. Noah crouched down, examining the edges of the depression. "Something's been sleeping here, recently." "Something big," I added, noting how the surrounding vegetation had been crushed flat in a roughly circular pattern about 12 feet in diameter. Jimmy was scanning the trees, his rifle held ready. "There's more. Look at the trunk." We turned our attention to the dead pine. About 8 feet up, deep gouges had been carved into the wood, not random claw marks, but deliberate patterns. They looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. "What the hell could do this?" Noah whispered, his hand now resting on his pistol. Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed through the trees, a long, low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't any animal call I'd ever heard, more like the sound of wind through a deep cave, but with an underlying intelligence that made my skin crawl. We stood frozen, listening as the sound faded away. In its wake, the silence seemed even more oppressive. Then Jimmy's radio squawked, making us all jump. Through the static, we could barely make out words. "Need backup. Oh God, it's not. Please." It was Ricky's voice. The radio message hit us like a physical blow. For 3 days we'd been hoping against hope that Ricky was alive, and now we had proof. But the terror in his voice suggested he might not stay that way for long. "Direction?" Noah asked, already pulling out his compass. I held up my hand for silence, straining to hear any hint of the transmission's origin. The radio crackled again, but this time all we got was static, and what sounded like heavy breathing. "There," Jimmy said, pointing northeast. "Signal's stronger when I hold the radio this way." We moved as fast as we dared through the undergrowth, trying to balance speed with stealth. The ground grew increasingly treacherous, the soil turning to thick mud that tried to pull our boots off with every step. The trees pressed closer together, their branches creating a tunnel of shadow despite the morning sun. The first body stopped us cold. It lay crumpled at the base of a massive Douglas fir, partially hidden by ferns. At first glance, it looked like a heap of discarded clothing, but the smell, sweet and coppery with decay, told a different story. Noah approached it cautiously, his training taking over. "Male, probably mid-30s, he reported clinically, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "Been dead maybe 2 days? Hard to tell with these injuries." I forced myself to look closer. The man was dressed for hiking, wearing expensive outdoor gear that was now shredded and caked with dried blood. His pack lay nearby, its contents scattered as if something had rifled through them. But it was the injuries that made my stomach lurch. His body had been torn apart with surgical precision. Long, parallel cuts ran from throat to navel, the edges too clean for animal claws. The chest cavity was empty, organs removed with what appeared to be deliberate care. His face was untouched, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Jimmy turned away and vomited into the bushes. I couldn't blame him. In 20 years of hunting, I'd never seen anything like this. This wasn't a predator kill. This was something else entirely. Look at this, Noah said, holding up the man's wallet. Montana driver's license, Thomas Wheeler from Missoula. Another hunter? I shook my head. No weapon, no hunting license in the wallet, maybe a hiker or photographer. He's got a camera, Jimmy said, having recovered enough to examine the scattered gear. He held up a high-end DSLR, its lens shattered. Memory cards missing. Before we could discuss it further, that moaning sound echoed through the trees again, closer this time. We instinctively drew together, backs to each other, scanning the surrounding forest. The shadows seemed to move, though there was no wind. "We need to call this in," Noah said, reaching for his satellite phone. He cursed. "No signal, we're in a dead zone." "We can't leave," I said, thinking of Ricky's voice on the radio. "He's still out there." Jimmy checked his rifle for the 100th time. What if we're not the only ones looking for him? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Something had killed Thomas Wheeler, something that didn't hunt like any natural predator, and now that same something might be hunting us. We pressed on, following a game trail that showed signs of recent passage. Broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, and more of that strange clear substance that seemed to be everywhere. The moaning sound came more frequently now, sometimes accompanied by a high-pitched chittering that set my teeth on edge. The trail led us to a small clearing where the trees had been bent and broken in a rough circle, their trunks twisted as if by enormous force. The ground was covered in deep impressions, like something massive had paced back and forth. And there, in the center of it all, was Ricky's satellite phone, smashed to pieces. "Blood," Noah said quietly, pointing to dark stains on the leaves. "A lot of it." I was about to respond when movement caught my eye, something large shifting in the shadows at the clearing's edge. We all saw it this time, our weapons coming up automatically. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a shape emerged from the darkness, and everything I thought I knew about the natural world collapsed. The creature that stepped into the clearing walked on 2 legs, but that's where any resemblance to anything natural ended. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a grotesque fusion of features that shouldn't exist together. The torso was vaguely ursine but stretched and distorted, covered in patches of hairless skin that seemed to shift and ripple. Its arms were too long, ending in hands with elongated fingers tipped with curved metallic-looking claws. But it was the face that struck true horror into my soul. It was almost feline in structure, but the proportions were wrong, as if someone had tried to sculpt a mountain lion's head from memory and gotten everything slightly incorrect. The eyes were the worst part, huge, lidless orbs that reflected the dim light like mirrors, with too many pupils floating in seas of absolute blackness. The creature's mouth opened, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, and that same moaning sound filled the air. But this time we could see its source. The sound wasn't coming from its throat, but from holes that dotted its body, opening and closing like grotesque gills. The sound was both a beacon and a warning, a call that seemed to ripple through the very ground beneath our feet. Noah fired first, his pistol shots echoing through the clearing. The bullets struck the creature's torso, but instead of blood, clear fluid erupted from the wounds, the same substance we'd been finding on the trees. The thing didn't flinch. If anything, it seemed amused, its face contorting into what might have been a smile. "Run!" I shouted. But Jimmy was already moving, firing his rifle as he backpedaled. The creature's response was explosive. It crossed the clearing in 2 impossibly fluid strides, one elongated arm sweeping out to catch Jimmy across the chest. He went flying, his rifle spinning away into the underbrush. Noah and I split up, trying to divide its attention. The creature paused, its head swiveling between us with jerky, bird-like movements. That's when we heard the scream, human, desperate, and terrifyingly familiar. "Ricky," I breathed. The sound had come from somewhere above us. The creature's head snapped toward me, those awful eyes fixing on my face. In that moment I realized it understood, not just the word, but the meaning behind it. This thing wasn't just some predator, it was intelligent. Noah used the moment to drag Jimmy to safety behind a fallen log. The younger man was conscious but dazed, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. I kept the creature's attention, slowly backing away toward the densest part of the forest. It followed, moving with that same unnatural grace, its body seeming to flow around obstacles rather than over them. Another scream pierced the air, closer this time. I looked up and felt my heart stop. About 30 feet above us, tangled in the branches of an ancient cedar, was Ricky. He was alive but badly injured, his body contorted in ways that suggested broken bones. His eyes met mine, wide with terror and recognition. "Abe," he croaked, "run, please, run." The creature's head tilted at an impossible angle, nearly backwards, to look up at Ricky. That horrible chittering sound started again, but this time I could see what caused it. Thousands of tiny, tooth-like structures vibrating along its spine. I had a choice to make. I could run, maybe make it back to the truck if I was lucky, or I could try to save my friend. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I pulled my hunting knife, the only weapon I had left, and charged. The creature seemed surprised by my attack, if such a thing could feel surprise. My blade sank deep into its side, drawing more of that clear fluid. Up close I could smell it, like ozone and rotting meat. The thing's reaction was immediate and violent. One of those grotesque hands wrapped around my throat, lifting me off the ground. Its grip was like steel cables wrapped in wet leather. I stabbed again and again, each strike seeming to do less damage than the last, as if its body was adapting to the wounds. Through darkening vision, I saw Noah running toward us, firing his pistol until it clicked empty. The creature barely seemed to notice. Jimmy had regained his feet and was searching desperately for his rifle. And above us, Ricky was trying to free himself from the branches, each movement clearly causing him agony. The world was starting to fade when I remembered the flare gun in my jacket pocket. With my last conscious strength, I pulled it out, pressed it against one of those horrible eyes, and pulled the trigger. The world exploded into red light and screaming. The creature dropped me, thrashing wildly as the flare burned into its head. That clear fluid began pouring from every opening in its body, steaming where it hit the ground. The thing's form seemed to collapse in on itself, its proportions becoming even more impossible as it died. I scrambled away, gasping for air. Noah and Jimmy were at my side in seconds, pulling me further from the dying creature. We watched in horror as it continued to dissolve, that terrible moaning sound growing weaker until it finally stopped. Getting Ricky down was a nightmare. His legs were broken along with several ribs. He was barely conscious, muttering about darkness and teeth and things that shouldn't exist. By the time we got him to the ground, the creature's body had dissolved completely, leaving only a scorched patch of earth and that lingering smell of ozone. The official report called it a bear attack. The authorities took samples from the scorched earth, conducted interviews, and eventually filed it all away in some forgotten drawer. Thomas Wheeler's death was attributed to the same bear. His family got closure, if not the truth. Ricky survived, but he was never the same. The physical injuries healed, but the mental scars ran deeper. He moved away from the reservation 6 months later, saying he couldn't bear to look at the mountains anymore. I don't blame him. Noah quit the tribal police force, took a job in Seattle. Jimmy stayed, but he doesn't go into the woods anymore. None of us do, not really. We know what's out there now, or at least we know that we don't know what's out there. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear that moaning sound again. It might be my imagination, or it might be that the thing we killed wasn't the only one of its kind. The elders say the old spirits never really left these lands. Maybe they were right. Maybe what we encountered wasn't some undiscovered animal, but something older, something that had been here long before us and will be here long after we're gone. I still have the knife I used that day. The blade is pitted and corroded where that clear fluid touched it, and sometimes in the right light, I swear I can see patterns etched into the metal, patterns that look disturbingly like the marks we found on that dead pine tree. I keep it as a reminder, not of our victory, but of our ignorance. We think we know the natural world, think we've cataloged and categorized every living thing, but the truth is, we've barely scratched the surface. There are things out there in the dark places of the world, things that defy our understanding of what's possible, and sometimes if we're very unlucky we find them, or maybe, just maybe, they find us. I've spent enough time in these woods to know their rhythms. the way morning fog clings to the Douglas firs until mid-afternoon, how the undergrowth shifts and settles as deer pick their way through salal bushes, the particular quality of silence that descends just before a storm rolls in from the Pacific. My name is Ty E. Warfield, and I've worked as a park ranger for the Knoll Indian Nation for the past decade. People always told me I had my grandfather's spirit, calm, methodical, steady in chaos. Those traits serve me well out here in the temperate rainforests of Washington state. The Knoll Reservation has been my home for most of my life. Our way of life here feels ancient, rooted in traditions that stretch back generations. My job seems simple on paper: maintain the forests, keep visitors safe, and respect the spirits that call these woods home. Most days follow a predictable pattern: checking trails, updating signage, helping lost hikers find their way back to marked paths. But there are other days, ones I rarely talk about, when something happens that defies explanation. My Uncle Thomas used to warn me about the deeper woods, past the old logging road where the trees grow impossibly tall, and the ground transforms into a thick carpet of moss and ferns. "That's the uncharted land," he'd say, his weathered face growing serious. "Not because we haven't mapped it, we have, but because it belongs to something else." He never explained what he meant by something else, but the way he said it made me picture ancient things with sharp teeth and longer memories than humans. I respected those boundaries for years, treating the old logging road like an invisible line between the known and unknown parts of the forest. Maybe if I'd maintained that respect, things would have turned out differently. But when the disappearances started this past summer, I had no choice but to cross that line. The ranger station where I work sits at the edge of the reservation, a sturdy log building with windows that look out over the main hiking trails. Inside, topographical maps cover the walls, their contour lines tracing the rises and falls of the land like fingerprints. My desk faces the door, allowing me to see visitors as soon as they enter. It was there on a misty June morning that I received the first report. Sarah Chen, an experienced hiker from Seattle, had set out 3 days earlier on what should have been a routine day hike. She'd filled out the trail register, marking her intended route: the Cedar Creek Loop, a popular trail that stayed well within the safe boundaries. When she didn't check out that evening, I assumed she'd decided to camp overnight, which wasn't uncommon during the summer months. But 3 days of silence was different. I found her car still parked at the trailhead, covered in a fine layer of rain-misted dust. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Something about the way it sat there, like it had been abandoned mid-thought, felt wrong. I called in the search teams and we combed the area for a week straight. Every trail, every possible deviation, every animal path that she might have followed. We found nothing: no backpack, no water bottle, no scraps of clothing caught on branches. It was as if Sarah Chen had simply ceased to exist the moment she stepped into these woods. During the search, I noticed something that bothered me more than the lack of evidence. The forest itself felt different. The familiar sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind moving through branches, seemed muted, distant, like the woods were holding their breath. My grandfather used to say that nature speaks to those who know how to listen. That day, it felt like nature was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. The tribal council met after we called off the search. I sat in the back of the meeting hall, listening as the elders discussed the disappearance. Most of them treated it as an unfortunate accident, a hiker who'd gotten lost, succumbed to exposure, or fallen in terrain too rough to search effectively. But I caught the way some of the older members exchanged glances when they thought no one was watching. They knew something they weren't saying. After the meeting, I approached Eleanor Blackwood, one of our oldest council members. Her family had lived on this land since before the reservation was established, and she knew more about our traditions than anyone else alive. When I asked her about the uncharted land, she studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Some boundaries exist for a reason, Ty," she said finally. "Our ancestors knew there were places in this world where humans shouldn't go. Not because we can't, but because we shouldn't. The forest remembers things we've forgotten." I wanted to press her for more details, but something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't fear, exactly. Eleanor Blackwood wasn't afraid of anything in this world. It was more like the look you might give a child who's about to learn a harsh truth about life. a mixture of sympathy and resignation. That night I stayed late at the ranger station, studying the maps of the area where Sarah had disappeared. The trail she'd planned to take was clearly marked in red, a gentle loop that never came close to the old logging road. But as I traced the route with my finger, I felt a nagging certainty that she'd gone off course. Something had drawn her deeper into the woods, past the boundaries that had kept us safe for generations. I didn't know it then, but Sarah Chen's disappearance was just the beginning. The forest was stirring, and the line between the charted and uncharted lands was about to blur in ways that would change everything I thought I knew about these woods. As I sat there studying the maps, the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the station windows. In the growing darkness, I could have sworn I heard something moving in the trees outside. Something big, something patient, something that didn't belong in any world I understood. Warren Lone Tree's disappearance hit the community harder than Sarah Chen's. While losing a tourist was tragic, losing one of our own, especially someone like Warren, shook people's faith in the forest itself. Warren had been hunting these woods since before I was born. He knew every game trail, every seasonal creek, every patch of huckleberries worth checking. The idea that he could vanish felt impossible, like saying the sun had forgotten to rise. I first heard something was wrong when his wife Mary called the ranger station. Warren hadn't returned from his morning hunt, which wasn't unusual. He often spent full days tracking deer through the understory. But his dog Scout had come home without him. Anyone who knew Warren knew that Scout never left his side. "Something's not right, Ty," Mary said, her voice tight with worry. "Scout came back alone and he's acting strange. Won't stop whining and pacing. Warren would never send him home alone." I grabbed my gear and headed out immediately. Mary was waiting in their front yard, Scout pressed against her leg. The dog's behavior set off alarm bells in my head. Scout was usually a bouncing bundle of energy, always ready to lead the way into the woods. But now he was crouched low, tail tucked, eyes darting between the tree line and my face. "Where did Warren plan to hunt today?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling about the answer. "He mentioned checking the ridge above Cedar Creek," Mary said. "Said the deer had been moving that way lately." Cedar Creek, the same area where Sarah Chen had disappeared. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but Mary knew these woods almost as well as Warren did. She caught the flicker of concern on my face. "There's something else," she added, her voice dropping. "Scout came back from the wrong direction. Warren would never hunt near the old logging road, but that's where Scout came from. I saw him emerge from that part of the forest myself." The old logging road, the boundary. My uncle's warnings echoed in my mind as I studied the tree line where Scout had emerged. The forest looked different there, darker, more dense, the trees pressing together like they were sharing secrets. I radioed for backup and assembled a search team. We started at Warren's usual hunting spots, working our way systematically through the areas he frequented. Scout refused to help track his master another red flag. The dog who'd spent his entire life following Warren's scent through these woods now balked at entering them at all. As we moved deeper into the forest, I noticed the same unnatural quiet that had marked Sarah Chen's disappearance. The woods felt wrong, like walking through a photograph instead of living forest. Even the most experienced members of the search team noticed it. Conversations died mid-sentence. People walked closer together than usual. Everyone kept glancing over their shoulders at shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. We found Warren's rifle 3 days into the search, propped carefully against a fallen log near the old logging road. Not dropped, not abandoned in haste, placed. The weapon was clean, no signs of struggle or blood nearby. Warren's tracks led up to that point and simply stopped, as if he'd been plucked from the earth. I studied the ground around the rifle for hours, looking for any sign of what might have happened. The forest floor told an impossible story. Warren had walked to this spot, stopped, and then nothing. No signs of dragging, no scuff marks from a struggle, no other tracks leading away. Just the rifle, standing like a grave marker at the edge of the uncharted land. The discovery changed something in the search team's dynamics. The younger members started requesting assignments closer to the populated areas. The older ones, especially those from families that had lived here for generations, grew quiet and watchful. They knew what I was starting to suspect, that these disappearances weren't accidents or typical cases of people getting lost in the wilderness. That evening I visited Eleanor Blackwood again. She was sitting on her porch, weaving a traditional basket from cedar bark, her gnarled fingers moving with practiced precision. Before I could speak, she looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You found something today," she said. It wasn't a question. "Warren's rifle," I replied, settling onto the porch steps, near the old logging road. Eleanor's fingers stilled. "The boundary is weakening," she said softly. "It happens sometimes when the balance shifts, when we forget to respect the old ways." "What balance?" I asked. "What are we dealing with?" She resumed her weaving, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate. "There are things in this world older than our stories about them, Ty. Things that were here before us and will be here after we're gone. They don't think like we do. They don't want what we want. They simply are." "And one of these things has Warren?" Eleanor tied off a strand of cedar bark before answering. "Warren crossed a line he shouldn't have. Whether he chose to or was drawn there doesn't matter now. The uncharted land claims what it wants." I left Eleanor's house with more questions than answers. But one thing was becoming clear. These disappearances weren't going to stop on their own. Something was pulling people into the deeper woods, past that invisible line between our world and whatever waited in the shadows beyond the old logging road. That night I dreamed of Warren's rifle standing guard at the boundary, and behind it, in the darkness between the trees, something watched with ancient, hungry eyes. When I woke, I could still feel its gaze on me, patient and calculating, like a predator sizing up its next meal. After Warren's disappearance, something changed in the way people viewed the forest. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was a fundamental shift in how the community related to the woods that had sustained us for generations. Hunting parties started traveling in larger groups. Trail guides refused to take tourists anywhere near the old logging road. Parents called their children in before sunset, even during the long summer evenings. The tribal council held emergency meetings twice a week, but they couldn't agree on what action to take. Some wanted to close the trails entirely. Others argued that abandoning our traditional hunting and gathering grounds would be worse than whatever threat we faced. Through it all, I kept patrolling, watching the forest for signs of something. I wasn't sure what. It was during this tense period that Joe Conklin went missing. Unlike Warren or Sarah Chen, Joe was what we called a regular irregular, someone who showed up every few months to spend time off the grid in a remote cabin he'd inherited from his uncle. He wasn't Quinoll, but he respected our ways and always checked in with the ranger station before heading up to his place. The last time I saw him, he seemed different, distracted. He kept looking past me into the woods while we talked, like he was listening for something. "Hear anything unusual lately, Ty?" he asked, still staring at the tree line. "At night, I mean, around the cabin." I told him no, but asked what he'd been hearing. "It's not exactly hearing," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "It's more like feeling something moving out there, something big, and the sounds that should be there aren't." I suggested he stay closer to the populated areas, given recent events. He nodded, promised he would, and headed up to his cabin. That was the last time anyone saw Joe Conklin. His wife reported him missing 3 days later. By then, I had already begun to suspect we had another disappearance on our hands. The forest had that same unnatural quiet I'd come to associate with the other incidents. Even the wind seemed to die when you entered certain areas, like nature itself was holding its breath. The search for Joe led us to his cabin first. Everything was in order, no signs of struggle, no evidence of animal intrusion. His truck was parked outside, camping gear still in the bed. Inside, we found his journal open on the kitchen table. The last entry caught my attention immediately. "Something's watching from the trees, not from the branches, from the trees, like the forest itself has eyes. They follow me when I walk the property line. The silence gets deeper every night. I think I understand now why the old stories say some parts of the woods belong to them, not us, them." The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page as if he'd been interrupted. What struck me wasn't just what he'd written, but how the handwriting deteriorated as it went on, becoming increasingly erratic. During the search, I found myself drawn to the areas near the old logging road. Something about Joe's last entry nagged at me, the way he'd written about the forest having eyes. I'd been feeling watched lately too, especially when my patrols took me near the boundary. On the fourth day of the search, I found something that made my blood run cold. Joe's flashlight, still on but growing dim, pointing into the darkness beyond the logging road. Like Warren's rifle, it seemed deliberately placed. But this time there was something else. Marks on the nearby trees that didn't match any animal I knew. They looked like claw marks, but wrong somehow. Too precise, too intentional. They formed patterns that almost seemed like writing, if you let your eyes unfocus slightly. I photographed them, but didn't share the pictures with the search team. Something told me these marks weren't meant for everyone to see. That evening, I visited Eleanor again. When I showed her the photos, her reaction confirmed my worst fears. She didn't speak for a long time, just traced the patterns with one wrinkled finger. "They're getting bolder," she finally said, "testing the boundaries, seeing how we'll respond." "They?" I asked. "What are we dealing with, Eleanor? What's really out there?" She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of ancient knowledge and genuine fear. "We call them the forest people in our old stories," she said, "but that's wrong. They're not people at all. They're what was here before people, before trees, before time as we understand it. They look like whatever they need to look like to hunt, and they're waking up." "Why now?" I asked. "What's changed?" "Everything changes," she replied. "The climate, the forests, the way people treat the old boundaries. Maybe they're hungry, maybe they're angry. Maybe they just are what they are, and we're the ones who forgot how dangerous that could be." I left Eleanor's house that night with a growing sense of dread. 3 people had vanished without a trace. Each disappearance had drawn us closer to the boundary, like something was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, leading us deeper into the uncharted land. That night, patrolling near the ranger station, I heard something that didn't belong. A sound like wet wood creaking, but organic, alive. I swept my flashlight beam through the trees but saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I thought about Joe's journal entry, about the forest having eyes. Standing there in the darkness, I realized he'd been right. The forest was watching, had always been watching. We just hadn't noticed until it started watching back with purpose. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep dancing around the edges of this thing. If something was hunting in our woods, drawing people into the uncharted land, I needed to understand what we were dealing with. I needed to cross the boundary myself. I knew it was dangerous, probably stupid. But I had my grandfather's spirit, they'd always said. Calm in chaos, methodical. I would prepare properly, take precautions, and I would not go alone. Deciding to cross the boundary was one thing. Planning how to do it safely was another. I spent a week gathering equipment and information, studying old tribal records, and talking to elders who might know something useful. Most gave me the same warning: don't go. The ones who said more spoke in riddles and metaphors that made my skin crawl. I chose Derek Blackwater as my partner for this expedition, not just because he was a skilled ranger, but because he came from one of the oldest Kinole families. His grandfather had been a medicine man, and Derek grew up hearing stories that most of us had forgotten. More importantly, he knew how to keep a cool head in strange situations. When I explained what I wanted to do, he didn't immediately reject the idea like I expected. Instead, he sat quietly for a long moment, cleaning his rifle, a habit he'd picked up from his time in the Marines. "My grandfather used to say there are places in the forest where the rules are different," he finally said, not looking up from his work. "Places where what we think we know about nature doesn't apply anymore. You sure you want to go poking around in that?" I showed him the photographs of the marks I'd found near Joe's flashlight, his hand stilled on the rifle. "I've seen marks like these before," he said quietly, "up near Black Eagle Peak when I was hunting with my grandfather. He made us leave immediately, said we'd wandered into someone else's hunting ground." "Someone else's?" I asked. "Or something else's?" Derek finally looked up at me. He never said, but I remember how fast we left. I'd never seen him scared before that day. Despite his reservations, Derek agreed to come with me. We spent 3 days preparing, gathering equipment that seemed almost absurd for a day patrol: night vision goggles, thermal cameras, satellite phones, emergency beacons. We even brought silver bullets, not because we believed in werewolves, but because Derek's grandfather had insisted that regular ammunition wouldn't work against what lived in the deep woods. The morning we set out was unnaturally still. No wind, no bird calls, not even insects buzzing. The forest felt like a held breath. We started at the old logging road where both Warren's rifle and Joe's flashlight had been found. The boundary wasn't marked on any map, but you could feel it, a subtle wrongness in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Look at the trees," Derek murmured as we crossed the logging road. He was right. Something was off about them. They seemed to grow at slightly wrong angles, creating patterns that hurt your eyes if you looked at them too long. The moss on their trunks grew in spiral patterns that felt deliberately placed. We moved slowly, documenting everything with cameras and GPS markers. The further we went, the more the forest changed. The undergrowth became denser, but wrong somehow. Plants that shouldn't grow together were intertwined. Ferns with too many fronds. Mushrooms that seemed to pulse slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. About 2 miles past the logging road, we found the first real evidence that we were on the right track. A clearing that didn't appear on any of our maps, perfectly circular, about 30 feet across. The trees around its edge were marked with the same strange patterns I'd photographed before, but here they were older, deeper, like they'd been carved repeatedly over years. Derek crouched to examine the ground at the clearing's edge. "The soil's different here," he said, rubbing it between his fingers. "Darker, and look at this." He pointed to what looked like tracks pressed into the earth. But if they were tracks, they belonged to nothing I'd ever seen before. They were too large, too geometrically precise, like something mechanical had made them, but with an organic fluidity that machinery couldn't replicate. We were photographing the tracks when we heard it, that wet wood sound I'd heard before, but louder now, closer. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Derek's hand went to his rifle, and I noticed he was loading the silver bullets. The air grew heavy, thick with an organic smell that reminded me of rotting leaves and stagnant water. The trees around the clearing seemed to lean inward, their branches creating shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. Then we saw it, or rather we saw parts of it, moving between the trees at the clearing's edge. It moved like smoke but had mass, like water but had form. The closest comparison I could make was a wolf, but that was like saying a hurricane was similar to a summer breeze. Its proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, too jointed, covered in something that looked like fur but moved like seaweed underwater. And its head, I still have trouble describing its head. Derek raised his rifle, but I put my hand on the barrel, pushing it down gently. The creature wasn't charging us, it was studying us, moving around the clearing's edge with deliberate slowness, testing us, learning us. Then it spoke, not in words, not exactly. The sound was like branches creaking in a storm, like rocks grinding together underground, like all the ancient noises of the forest compressed into something that might have been language. I couldn't understand it, but I felt its meaning in my bones. This was a warning. We had crossed a line. We were being given one chance to go back. Derek felt it too. I could see it in his face. The same primal recognition that our ancestors must have felt when they first realized they weren't alone in the dark. We backed out of the clearing slowly, keeping our eyes on the shifting shadows where the creature moved. It followed us to the edge of the uncharted land, always just visible enough to remind us it was there, never close enough to see clearly. When we crossed back over the logging road, it stopped. Through the trees, I saw it rear up to its full height, easily 15 feet tall, and for just a moment, I saw its face. I won't describe what I saw, I can't. Some things, once seen, change you forever. But I understood then why Warren and Joe and Sarah had vanished so completely. Some predators don't just kill their prey, they unmake them. After our encounter in the clearing, Derek and I spent hours debating what to do. The rational part of me wanted to report everything, the tracks, the markings, the creature itself. But who would believe us? More importantly, who should believe us? Some knowledge changes things that can't be unchanged. "We have to tell the council," Derek finally said, his voice hoarse. We were sitting in the ranger station, maps spread across my desk, marking the locations of everything we'd seen. If that thing is hunting our people, they need to know. I thought about Eleanor's warnings about boundaries and balance. What if knowing makes it worse? I asked. What if awareness is what it wants? Derek's hands were shaking slightly as he cleaned his rifle, a nervous habit now rather than a calming one. It's already hunting, and it's getting bolder. You saw those tracks? They were fresh but different from the older ones. It's changing its patterns. He was right. The creature was evolving its hunting strategy, drawing people deeper into its territory with calculated precision. The disappearances weren't random. They were tests, each one probing our defenses, learning our responses. We called an emergency council meeting the next day. The elders listened in silence as we described what we'd found. I expected disbelief, dismissal. Instead, the oldest among them exchanged knowing looks. They'd been waiting for this. It was bound to happen, Eleanor said after we finished. The balance has been shifting for years. The old agreements are breaking down. Agreements? I asked. What agreements? Our ancestors made pacts, another elder, James Running Bear, explained. Boundaries were established. We stayed in our territory, they stayed in theirs. But things change, the climate shifts, the forest shrinks, and they adapt. The council debated through the night. Some wanted to close the forest entirely. Others argued for more aggressive patrols. In the end, they decided to mark new boundaries, not with fences or signs, but with traditional warnings that only those who needed to understand would recognize. But it was too late. The creature struck again 3 days later, but differently this time. No disappearance, no mystery. Instead, it left messages. We found them carved into trees near the populated areas, those same geometric patterns. But now they seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence at night. Derek and I analyzed them with the help of tribal elders. The markings weren't random. They were a language of sorts, ancient symbols that our ancestors had understood, but we had forgotten. What we could decipher wasn't encouraging. Territory, hunger, challenge. Then the dream started. Everyone in the community reported the same thing, visions of the forest at night seen through eyes that weren't human. The sensation of hunting, of stalking prey that walked on 2 legs. The dreams grew more vivid each night, more invasive. I barely slept, spending my nights patrolling, watching the boundary. The forest was changing more rapidly now. Trees seemed to move when no one was looking directly at them. The darkness between them grew deeper, more absolute, and always that sense of being watched, of being assessed. It all came to a head on a moonless night in late summer. Derek and I were patrolling the new boundary line when we heard screams coming from the direction of Warren's old hunting cabin. We ran toward the sound, knowing what we'd find, but hoping we were wrong. The creature was there, fully visible this time, its form no longer hidden by shadow. It stood in the cabin's yard, towering over a group of teenage hikers who had ignored the warnings and ventured too close to the boundary. In the beam of our flashlights, its body seemed to shift and flow, never quite settling on one shape. Derek raised his rifle, loaded with the silver bullets his grandfather had insisted on. I drew my sidearm, knowing it would be useless but needing to do something. The creature turned toward us, and in its face, its terrible, impossible face, I saw recognition. What happened next is still hard to describe. The creature moved with impossible speed, but Derek was faster. His first shot caught it in the side, the silver bullet tearing through whatever passed for its flesh. The sound it made, part roar, part scream, part something else entirely, shook the trees themselves. The teenagers ran. We held our ground. The creature charged, its form elongating, limbs stretching like smoke but striking like steel. It knocked Derek aside with terrifying force. I heard bones crack. Then, from the darkness, came another shot. Connor McAllister, another ranger who had been patrolling nearby, emerged from the trees with his rifle raised. His shot caught the creature in what might have been its throat. It staggered, black ichor pouring from its wounds. For a moment everything stopped. The creature stood there, swaying, its form beginning to lose cohesion. Then it collapsed, its body folding in on itself like paper burning in reverse. The ground where it fell turned black and dead. Nothing would ever grow there again. We never found the bodies of those who disappeared. The tribal council ordered the creature's remains buried deep in the forest. in a place marked with warnings that future generations would hopefully remember to heed. Derek recovered from his injuries, though he retired from ranger service. Some wounds go deeper than bone. The forest is different now. The boundary between the charted and uncharted lands is clearer, stronger. But sometimes, on very dark nights, I hear sounds from beyond the old logging road that remind me we didn't win anything that night. We just restored a balance that was never meant to be permanent. I still patrol these woods, but differently now, more cautiously, more respectfully. The locals say the forest is like a living thing, always listening. They're wrong. The forest isn't like a living thing, it is a living thing. And some parts of it remember when humans were prey. Every now and then I find new markings on the trees near the boundary, different from the ones before, but carrying the same weight of ancient knowledge and warning. They remind me that we don't own these woods. We never did. We just share them with things that were here long before us, and will remain long after we're gone. My grandfather's spirit serves me well out here, calm, methodical, steady in chaos. But he taught me something else too, something I now understand better than ever: respect the boundaries. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed, some territories aren't meant to be shared, and some guardians of the forest aren't friendly. That's just the way it is, and that's the way it needs to stay. The first signs came with the changing of the seasons. Summer was waning, giving way to autumn's chill, and the tourists were finally starting to thin out around Southampton. It wasn't the first time I'd felt something was wrong in the woods. As a child, I'd always felt the land had a pulse, like it was breathing around us. I grew up on the Shinnecock Reservation, where the forest stretched long and wide, an ancient presence that had watched over our people for countless generations. My family had been part of the Shinnecock Nation for as far back as we could trace, but my ancestors weren't just settlers here. They belonged to this land. The elders always said that the woods had seen more than just human history. It had memories older than the trees, older than the soil. Most people didn't take those stories seriously, but I did. My grandmother, Sarah Whitedeer, was different from the other elders. While they spoke in riddles and metaphors about our connection to the land, she was direct, almost stern in her warnings. "Listen to me, Daniel," she'd say, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength. "If you listen hard enough, you can hear the land whisper secrets in the wind, but some secrets are warnings, and some are threats." That's what kept me close to home. At 33, I was still here, working as a park ranger in the Shinnecock Hills Preserve. I liked my job. It was quiet, except for the summers when tourists clogged up the roads and turned everything into chaos. Even then, the tourists stayed away from the denser parts of the forest. I think they sensed what I did, that some places were meant to be left alone. My daily routine was simple: patrol the trails, check the camping areas, and make sure no one was doing anything stupid enough to get themselves killed. I knew every tree, every bend in the path, every rocky outcropping. The forest was as familiar to me as my own reflection. But lately, something had changed. The birds had grown quiet. The usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush had ceased. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the moments before a devastating storm. The first deer carcass appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September. I found it while doing my regular patrol along the Eastern Trail. At first I thought it might have been a coyote attack. We'd had problems with them before, but this was different. The deer hadn't just been killed, it had been destroyed. Its rib cage was splayed open like a broken umbrella, organs missing, limbs twisted at impossible angles. 20 years of working these woods, and I'd never seen anything like it. I radioed it in and took photos for the Wildlife Service. They'd want to know about any unusual predator activity. But something about the scene made my skin crawl. The way the deer had been positioned, almost deliberately, in a small clearing. The strange, deep gouges in the surrounding trees. The complete absence of scavengers, no crows, no foxes, not even flies buzzing around the carcass. 2 days later, I found 2 more deer in similar condition. Each kill was more violent than the last, with signs of almost methodical brutality. The Wildlife Service people were baffled. They talked about mountain lions, about bear attacks, but I knew better. Bears don't play with their food. They don't arrange body parts in patterns. They don't leave claw marks 8 feet up a tree trunk. That's when the disappearances started. Marty Wheeler wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to find working at a kayak rental shop. He was a city boy, complete with designer sunglasses and carefully maintained stubble. He'd taken the summer job as a way to reconnect with nature, or so he'd told everyone who'd listen. But there was something endearing about his enthusiasm, his genuine desire to learn about the area and its history. When he didn't show up for his shift on a busy Saturday morning, people noticed. His car was still in the employee parking lot, his bright blue mountain bike chained to the rack outside. The police did a preliminary search, but they weren't too concerned at first. People sometimes went off trail, got lost for a day or two. It happened every summer. But I knew this was different. The timing was too perfect, too closely aligned with the animal deaths. I joined the search party, leading them through the areas I knew best. We found his bike lock cut clean through, the bike itself abandoned nearly 2 miles into the dense woodland. The front wheel was bent, like it had been thrown against something hard. There was blood on the handlebars. The search intensified after that. Police helicopters buzzed overhead. Search dogs combed the underbrush, and volunteers from neighboring towns joined the effort. But we found nothing. No body, no clothing, no signs of struggle beyond that abandoned bike. It was like Marty Wheeler had simply vanished into thin air. Ethan Redhawk was different. He wasn't some tourist or seasonal worker. He was Shinnecock, born and raised on the reservation just like me. His grandmother, Mary Redhawk, had been friends with my grandmother for decades. They'd grown up together, shared the old stories, kept the old ways alive. When Mary came to my door that morning, her eyes were red from crying. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling, "Ethan didn't come home last night. He went hunting yesterday afternoon, said he'd be back before dark." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "You have to find him, the land. It's angry. Something's wrong." I knew what she meant. The feeling had been growing stronger every day, that sense of wrongness in the woods. The air had grown thick with an unfamiliar smell, something chemical and sharp that burned the back of my throat. The trees seemed to lean away from certain areas, their branches twisted as if trying to escape something unseen. We found Ethan 2 days later. What was left of him anyway. His body, or rather the pieces of it, were scattered across a small clearing deep in the oldest part of the forest. His rifle lay nearby, unfired. The police tried to blame it on a bear attack, but I'd seen bear attacks before. This was something else entirely. After Ethan's death, I couldn't wait any longer. Whatever was out there, it was getting bolder, more aggressive. It needed to be stopped. I went home and pulled out my grandfather's old Winchester Model 70, a rifle I'd never thought I'd need to use. The weapon felt wrong in my hands. We were supposed to be protectors of this land, not hunters. But sometimes protection requires action. I loaded the rifle with heavy rounds, the kind meant for large predators. In my pack, I put extra ammunition, a first aid kit, water, and emergency supplies. I also tucked in a small medicine bundle my grandmother had given me years ago, wrapped in red cloth and tied with sinew. "For protection," she'd said, "from things that shouldn't be here." The forest was different that evening. The usual sounds, wind in the leaves, birds calling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, were completely absent. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. The air felt thick, almost oily, and that chemical smell was stronger than ever. I headed toward the area where we'd found Ethan's body. The trees grew denser there, old-growth forest that had never been logged. The canopy was so thick that even in midday, the forest floor was cast in perpetual twilight. As I moved deeper into the woods, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin prickled with gooseflumps despite the warm evening air. I first saw it as a shadow, a darkness deeper than the surrounding gloom. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The human mind tends to find patterns in darkness, to create shapes where none exist. But then it moved. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall even in its hunched posture. Its proportions were all wrong, like something had taken the basic template of a bear or a man and stretched it, twisted it into something that shouldn't exist. Its limbs were too long, too thick, ending in hands that were almost human but not quite, with fingers that terminated in curved blackened claws. But it was the head, that made my blood run cold. It was elongated, almost triangular, with a flat face that reminded me of an owl or a hawk, but grotesquely oversized. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark, sunken hollows, but I could feel it watching me. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a patchwork of textures, some areas smooth and almost metallic, others rough and organic, like burnt flesh or rotting wood. The smell hit me then, stronger than ever. It was a combination of decay and something else, something artificial and wrong. It reminded me of chemical spills I'd seen in environmental training videos, that sharp, acrid scent that warns of human interference gone horribly wrong. When it charged, it moved with impossible speed for something so large. I barely had time to raise the rifle before it was on me. The first shot caught it in the shoulder, the impact spraying a dark, viscous fluid that wasn't quite blood. The creature didn't even slow down. I dove to the side as its massive arm swung past me, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle my hair. The claws caught my shoulder, ripping through my jacket and into flesh. The pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline kept me moving. I rolled, came up on one knee and fired again. This time the shot hit center mass. The creature staggered, letting out a sound that no natural animal could make, a high, keening shriek that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. The trees around us trembled, leaves falling like rain. The smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable. I fired again and again, each shot driving the thing back. Dark fluid poured from its wounds, sizzling where it hit the ground, killing the grass and undergrowth on contact. The creature's movements became erratic, its limbs twitching and spasming. With my last shot, I aimed for its head. The bullet struck true and the thing collapsed. Its body continued to twitch and convulse, the chemical smell growing stronger with each passing moment. As I watched, its flesh seemed to break down, dissolving into a dark, viscous mass that ate into the forest floor. The official story was simple. A bear, driven mad by disease or injury, had been responsible for the attacks. The government people who came to collect the remains wore hazmat suits and took samples of the soil where the creature had fallen. They asked questions but provided no answers. Within a week they were gone, leaving behind only a carefully sanitized report about animal attacks and a warning about staying on marked trails. But the truth spread through the reservation like a whisper in the wind. The elders gathered in private, speaking in low voices about old stories, about warnings passed down through generations, about things that lived in the spaces between the natural and the artificial, creatures born from humanity's careless manipulation of the natural world. The forest has begun to heal. New growth covers the scarred earth where the creature fell, though nothing quite grows right in that spot. The birds have returned, and the deer are slowly coming back. But something has changed. The land remembers, and so do we. Sometimes late at night I sit on my porch and listen to the wind in the trees. My grandmother always said the land would whisper secrets if you listened hard enough. Now I understand what she meant. The whispers are warnings, reminders that there are things in this world that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. The tourists still come, of course. They still crowd the beaches and trails during the summer months, taking pictures and leaving trash behind. But they stay away from the deeper parts of the forest now. Something in their primitive hindbrain warns them away from those dark places where the trees grow too close together and the shadows move in ways they shouldn't. As for me, I still patrol the woods. It's my job, after all. But I carry my rifle now, and my grandmother's medicine bundle never leaves my side. Because I know the truth, that thing wasn't alone. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, in the spaces between what's natural and what's man-made, others are waiting, watching, and remembering. The land has a long memory, and so do its guardians. The weight of my grandmother's funeral still pressed heavy on my shoulders as I walked through the desolate woods surrounding Red River Gorge in Kentucky. The late October air carried a bitter chill, but I barely noticed it. My name is Elijah Whitefeather, and I belong to the Cherokee Nation, though sometimes I feel like I don't fully belong anywhere. At 32, I've lived my life straddling two worlds, the spiritual traditions of my ancestors and the grounded reality of modern life. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. As a wilderness guide, I knew these woods better than most, having taken the job after my service in Afghanistan. It kept me close to the land and far from the noise of society, the best way I'd found to deal with the ghosts of war, both literal and metaphorical. My grandmother, Sarah Whitefeather, had been our family's connection to the old ways. Even as dementia slowly claimed her memories in recent years, she never forgot the stories, the warnings about these woods. "The land remembers," she would say, her dark eyes intense despite her failing health. "It remembers everything we try to forget." I adjusted my pack, feeling the familiar weight of my survival gear. No gun, though. I'd stopped carrying one after leaving the service. Some problems couldn't be solved with bullets, and the weight of a firearm brought back too many memories I'd rather keep buried. Besides, this was supposed to be a short hike to clear my head after the funeral, nothing more. The silence should have been my first warning. In all my years of guiding, I'd never heard the forest this quiet. No wind stirred the leaves, no birds called from the branches, and even the ever-present hum of insects had fallen silent. The stillness felt oppressive, as if the woods were holding its breath. I paused at a fallen log, running my hand along the bark. The wood was scarred, deep gouges torn through the thick bark in parallel lines. Something about the spacing of the marks made my skin crawl. They were too wide for a bear, too deep for a mountain lion, and far too deliberate for any animal I knew. My training kicked in automatically as I examined the ground around the log. Years of tracking both animals and people had taught me to read the smallest signs, but what I found only deepened my unease. Large patches of earth had been disturbed, the leaf litter scraped away in long, sweeping patterns. Whatever had passed through here had dragged something heavy. I told myself it was probably a bear dragging a deer carcass, but the explanation felt hollow. Bears left distinct signs, broken branches, scattered debris, clear prints. This was different. The ground looked almost polished in places, as if something had slithered across it with impossible weight. My grandmother's words echoed in my memory. "There are things in these woods older than our stories, Elijah. Things that walk between worlds. The ancestors knew to fear them, but we've forgotten why." The rational part of my mind, the part shaped by military training and modern skepticism, urged me to turn back. But something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had kept me alive in combat, pushed me forward. I needed to understand what I was seeing. The trees began to thin, and I found myself approaching a small clearing. The last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and reds, but the clearing itself seemed darker than it should be, as if the shadows had substance. That's when I saw it. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees, stood something that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly so, its proportions all wrong for any living creature. The body was elongated, stretched like taffy, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. But it was the face, or rather the absence of one, that made my blood run cold. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface, like an unfinished sculpture. The skin, if you could call it that, had a strange iridescent quality, catching what little light remained in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at it. I'd faced death before. In the mountains of Afghanistan, I'd stared down the barrels of enemy weapons and walked through fields of hidden explosives. But nothing in my military experience had prepared me for this moment. My body refused to move, caught in some primal freeze response that overrode years of training. The thing moved with a terrible grace, each movement precise and deliberate. Its limbs folded and unfolded like a grotesque origami creation, carrying it closer to where I stood. No footsteps broke the silence. It moved as if floating just above the ground. My grandmother had spoken of the Watchers, beings that existed before humans walked the earth. "They have no names," she'd said, "because names give power over things, and nothing has power over them." I'd always assumed these were just stories meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Now, facing this thing, I understood the true purpose of those warnings. The scream that shattered the silence was almost a relief. It broke whatever spell had held me in place, and I spun toward the source of the sound. Two figures burst from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, hikers by their gear and clothing. They were young, probably college students, and terror had transformed their faces into masks of panic. "Help!" the woman cried out, her voice raw with fear. "Something took Mike. It just grabbed him and—" The thing in the clearing turned its featureless face toward them, its body twisting in a way that made my stomach lurch. In that moment of distraction, survival instinct finally overcame paralysis. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a thick fallen branch, and acted the branch connected with the creature's midsection, with a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the solid thunk of wood striking flesh, but a hollow, resonant tone, like striking an empty oil drum. The thing's body bent around the impact in impossible ways, folding in on itself before snapping back to its original shape. "Help me!" I shouted to the male hiker, who I would later learn was named Carter. He stood frozen for a moment before rushing forward, armed with his own branch. Together we struck at the creature, driving it back toward a deep ravine I knew lay just beyond the clearing's edge. The thing never made a sound, even as we landed blow after blow. Its movements became increasingly erratic, its limbs twisting and contorting as it tried to maintain its balance. When Carter's strike finally sent it tumbling into the ravine, we didn't hesitate. We scrambled down the slope, throwing rocks and branches onto its prone form until it was completely buried. The female hiker, Liz, was nearly hysterical by the time we finished. Between sobs, she and Carter told me about their friend Mike. They'd been hiking the trail when something had reached out from between the trees and simply taken him. They'd heard his scream cut off midway, followed by a wet tearing sound that made Liz retch as she described it. We searched for Mike until well past midnight. The rangers arrived with their dogs, but the animals refused to follow the trail of blood that led deeper into the woods. They would approach a certain point, then sit down and whine, refusing to go further. What we eventually found of Mike Jenkins, age 22, would haunt my dreams for years to come. His body, what remained of it, showed signs of feeding that matched no known predator. The official report listed it as a bear attack, but I knew better. The rangers knew better too, though they never said it aloud. That was 3 years ago. I still work as a guide in Red River Gorge, but I never take groups near that clearing. The rangers have marked the area as environmentally sensitive, closed to hikers, though they never say why. Sometimes late at night I think about what's buried under those rocks and branches. Carter and Liz never returned to Kentucky. Last I heard, they'd both transferred to colleges in the Midwest, as far from mountains and forests as they could get. They don't talk about what happened that night. I know because I've tried to contact them. Some experiences are too much for the human mind to process. My grandmother was right about the old ways, about respecting what we don't understand. Modern life makes it easy to forget that we're not the only things that walk this earth. There are spaces between what we know and what we fear, and sometimes those spaces have teeth. I still guide people through these woods, sharing sanitized stories about local history and wildlife. But I keep my grandmother's warnings close to my heart now. When the forest falls silent, when the shadows move in ways they shouldn't, I remember what lies buried in that ravine, and I wonder if one day those rocks will be moved aside, and that smooth blank face will once again emerge into our world. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I drive out to the ranger station and check the security cameras that face that section of the forest. Nothing ever appears on the footage, but occasionally the cameras go dark for exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The rangers blame it on equipment malfunction. I know better. The thing about monsters is that once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. They change the way you look at the world. Every shadow holds the potential for horror. Every silence carries the weight of anticipation. But maybe that's how we're supposed to live, aware that we're not alone, that we're not at the top of the food chain, that there are things in this world older and stranger than our civilized minds can comprehend. I still have the branch I used that night, mounted above my fireplace. Sometimes late at night I swear I can hear it humming, resonating with something distant but drawing closer. And when that happens, I remember my grandmother's final words to me, whispered from her deathbed. "The watchers never sleep, Elijah. They just wait." The last bit of autumn light filtered through the dense pines as I wiped grease from my hands, studying the pickup truck's engine block with growing frustration. My name's Elon Keokuk, and I've spent most of my life in these northern Wisconsin woods. The repair shop I run near Chihuahua isn't much to look at, just a weathered building with peeling paint and an old neon open sign that flickers more often than it glows. But it's mine, and I'm proud of it. My grandfather used to say that every piece of land holds its own stories, its own spirits. He taught me the old ways of our people, the Oneida, passing down traditions that some might call superstitious, but that I've always known as truth. Those teachings have stayed with me through the years, whispering in the back of my mind during quiet moments like this one, when the day begins to fade and shadows creep across the workshop floor. I'd been working on Mrs. Peterson's '98 Ford F-150 for the better part of the afternoon. The timing belt was shot, and the radiator had seen better days, but these were problems I could fix. Simple, mechanical issues with logical solutions. Unlike the other thing that had been troubling me lately, the strange atmosphere that had settled over the woods behind my shop like a heavy blanket. My dog, Noden, a battle-scarred German shepherd who'd been by my side for 8 years, lay near the shop's entrance. Usually he'd be sleeping, but today his ears were pricked forward, his body tense. Every few minutes he'd lift his head and let out a low growl, staring through the open door at the tree line beyond. "What's got you worked up, old boy?" I asked, though I already had my suspicions. We'd both been hearing things over the past few nights, sounds that didn't belong in these woods. I'd grown up hunting here, tracked deer through these trees since I was old enough to hold a rifle, but these noises were different, deeper, wrong. The sun was setting earlier now that October was drawing to a close, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath in the dim light of the shop. I reached for the thermostat, but before I could adjust it, Noden suddenly sprang to his feet, hackles raised, and let out a bark that echoed through the metal building. I'd been trying to ignore the signs for days, writing them off as paranoia or too many late nights alone in the shop. But there was no denying the way the wildlife had changed. The usual chorus of birds had gone quiet, and I hadn't seen a deer near the shop in over a week. Unusual for this time of year when they typically grew bold, searching for food before winter set in. Setting down my wrench, I walked to the shop's entrance, Noden pressing against my leg. The woods stretched out before us like a wall of darkness, the dense pines creating shadows within shadows. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, and carried an unfamiliar scent, something musty and rank, like wet fur mixed with decay. "Easy, boy," I murmured, resting my hand on Noden's head. His muscles were rigid under my touch, and a continuous low growl rumbled in his chest. In the distance, branches snapped, not the gentle breaking of a deer picking its way through undergrowth, but the violent cracking of something large moving without concern for stealth. I reached for the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the door, its weight reassuring in my hand. The beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the first row of trees, their bark dark and wet from the afternoon's drizzle. Nothing moved in that initial sweep of light, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Charlie Weber, my closest neighbor whose property bordered mine to the north, had mentioned something similar yesterday. He'd stopped by to have me look at his chainsaw, and while I worked, he'd talked about finding strange tracks in his backfield, prints too large for a bear, with claw marks that cut deep into the earth. The decision to investigate probably wasn't the smartest I'd ever made, but something in me needed to know what was out there. I grabbed my hunting knife from the workbench and strapped it to my belt, then pulled on my heavy canvas jacket. The temperature had dropped another few degrees, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I stepped outside. Noden stayed close, his body pressed against my leg as we moved toward the tree line. The sound of breaking branches had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the pine needles above us motionless. 20 yards into the woods, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made me stop short. The ground was torn up, earth scattered as if something had been digging, but it was the marks on the nearby trees that held my attention. Deep gouges ran up the trunks higher than I could reach, the wood beneath splintered and raw. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my fingers over the marks. They were fresh, the sap still sticky. Whatever had made them was strong enough to tear through solid pine like it was paper. A crash in the undergrowth ahead made both Noden and me jump. The dog's barking turned frantic, and I had to grab his collar to keep him from charging forward. The beam of my flashlight swept through the trees, catching glimpses of movement, something large and dark, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. The first clear view I got of the creature would stay with me for the rest of my life. It emerged from behind a massive pine, its bulk making the tree seem small in comparison. Standing upright, it must have been 8 feet tall, with a broad, muscled torso covered in thick, bristling fur. But it was the way it moved that struck me the most, a horrible combination of animal and human traits that my mind struggled to process. Its arms were too long, ending in hands that were more like claws, each finger tipped with a curved talon that could have easily torn through flesh and bone. The head was wolf-like, but wrong, with a broader skull and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. Noden's barking had turned to whimpers, his earlier bravado replaced by primal fear. I couldn't blame him. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I stood frozen, watching as the creature lowered itself to all fours and began moving toward us with a terrible grace. The stench hit me then, the smell of rotting meat and wet fur so strong it made my eyes water. I started backing away slowly, trying to remember everything I knew about predators. Don't run, don't show fear. But this thing wasn't like any predator I'd ever encountered, and as it lifted its head to look at me, I saw something in its eyes that shattered all my assumptions. It wasn't just hunting. It was playing with us. Everything happened too fast after that. The creature launched itself forward with explosive force, covering the distance between us in a single bound. I shoved Noden aside and dove in the opposite direction, feeling the rush of air as claws swept through the space where I'd been standing. The flashlight went flying, its beam spinning crazily through the trees before going dark. I rolled to my feet, drawing my hunting knife even though I knew it would be useless against something this size. The creature turned to face me, rising to its full height, and in the dim light, I could see its mouth open in what looked almost like a grin, revealing rows of yellowed fangs. Noden, loyal to a fault, launched himself at the beast's leg, teeth sinking into its thick hide. The creature barely seemed to notice, casually swatting him aside with enough force to send him crashing into a nearby tree. The sound of his yelp cut through me like a knife. I had no time to check on him, though, as the creature's attention returned to me. It moved with that impossible speed again, but this time I was ready. As it lunged, I ducked under its reaching claws and drove my knife up into its side with all my strength. The blade sank deep into flesh, and hot black blood poured over my hands. The roar it let out shook the trees, a sound of pain and rage that couldn't have come from any natural animal. Its claws caught my jacket, ripping through the heavy canvas and scoring lines of fire across my ribs. I stumbled backward, losing my grip on the knife, which remained buried in the creature's flesh. Just when I thought it was over, when I was sure I was about to die in these woods I'd known all my life, I heard Charlie's voice ring out through the trees. "Elan, get down!" I dropped without thinking, and the crack of his rifle split the night. The creature jerked as the bullet struck it, dark blood spraying from its shoulder. Charlie fired again and again, each shot finding its mark, but the beast seemed more enraged than hurt. It turned toward this new threat, giving me time to scramble away. Charlie stood his ground, working the bolt of his rifle with practiced speed, but I could see the terror on his face as the creature started moving toward him. Just as it tensed to spring, another shot rang out, this one from a different direction. The bullet caught the beast in the head, staggering it. Through the trees I caught a glimpse of old Joe Thompson, my grandfather's friend and one of the tribal elders, holding his ancient .30-06 rifle. The creature seemed to hesitate, looking between its 3 opponents, before finally turning and crashing away through the underbrush, leaving a trail of black blood in its wake. We found Noden alive but hurt, whimpering softly where he'd fallen. My hand shook as I checked him over, finding bruised ribs but nothing broken, a miracle given the force with which he'd been thrown. Charlie helped me carry him back to the shop while old Joe covered our retreat, his rifle ready. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. My side was bleeding where the creature's claws had caught me, though the wounds weren't deep. Charlie's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he set his rifle down. "I've been hunting these woods for 40 years, he said, his voice hoarse. "Never seen anything like that. Never even heard of anything like that." Old Joe remained silent, staring out the shop's window into the darkness. Finally he spoke, his voice grave. "The old stories speak of things that walk between worlds, creatures that don't belong in our reality but find their way in sometimes. The elders called them the shadow walkers." I thought of my grandfather then, of all the stories he'd told me that I'd half believed. How many of them had been warnings rather than just tales? In the days that followed, we found more evidence of the creature's presence, more dead deer torn apart and partially eaten, and tracks that led deeper into the forest before disappearing entirely. The local authorities blamed it on a rogue bear, but those of us who had seen it knew better. Old Joe gathered the tribal elders, and they performed ceremonies I hadn't seen since I was a child. They spoke of boundaries between worlds growing thin, of ancient powers stirring. They warned us to be careful, to watch the woods and listen to our instincts. Noden recovered slowly, but he never strayed far from my side after that night. The wounds on my ribs healed, leaving scars that served as a constant reminder of what lurked in the darkness. Charlie took to carrying his rifle everywhere, and we both installed better security lights around our properties. But sometimes, late at night when the wind blows through the pines and shadows move across the walls, I think about those eyes, intelligent, ancient, and hungry. I think about how thin the line is between our world and whatever dark place that creature came from, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for another chance to cross that line. The old stories say that once these beings find a way into our world, they never truly leave. They just wait, patient and eternal, for the right moment to emerge again. So I keep my knife sharp, my rifle loaded, and I watch the woods, because I know now that my grandfather was right. There are things in this world that can't be explained, things that live in the shadows between what we know and what we fear to know. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries strange sounds through the trees, I swear I can hear it moving out there, waiting for its chance to return. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature's tracks had vanished, but something told me it hadn't gone far. I started digging into tribal records, spending evenings with Old Joe and other elders, learning about the shadow walkers that had haunted our people's stories for generations. "These beings," Old Joe explained one night, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of strong coffee, "they're drawn to places where the barriers are weak, places where great violence or sorrow has occurred." He paused, his eyes distant. "Did you know that back in 1878 there was a massacre not far from your shop? A group of settlers attacked a small Oneida hunting party. 15 people died that day." The information sent a chill down my spine. I'd known these woods my whole life, but I'd never known that history. "Is that why it's here?" I asked. Old Joe shook his head slowly. "It's part of it, but there's more. These creatures, they're patient. They watch, they learn, and they choose their hunting grounds carefully. Your shop sits at a crossroads of sorts, not just physical roads, but spiritual paths our ancestors used for centuries. The first snow of winter came early that year, blanketing the woods in white. The silence it brought should have been peaceful, but instead it felt oppressive, like a held breath. Noden had healed well, but he remained unusually vigilant, growling at shadows and refusing to leave the shop after sunset. Charlie and I had taken to patrolling our properties together, always armed, always watching. We found more signs: deer carcasses buried under fresh snow, trees marked with those terrible claw marks, and once a set of tracks that started in the middle of an untouched field, as if the creature had materialized from thin air. One evening, as darkness settled over the land, Mrs. Thompson, Old Joe's wife and a respected medicine woman, came to the shop. She carried a small leather pouch and wore a grave expression that made my heart sink. "The signs are bad," she said without preamble. "Last night every dog in the village was howling. The birds have all gone, and I've seen shadows moving where no shadows should be. It's getting stronger, Elan. It's preparing for something. The full moon rose huge and golden over the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. I'd closed the shop early, heeding Mrs. Thompson's warning about this night. The hunter's moon, she called it, when the barrier between worlds grew thinnest. Charlie arrived just before sunset, his rifle loaded with special rounds old Joe had helped prepare. Bullets blessed in a ceremony I wasn't allowed to witness, carved with symbols I didn't understand. Mrs. Thompson had given us each a small pouch of herbs to wear around our necks, saying they would help us see through the creature's illusions. We weren't alone in our vigil. Other tribal members had positioned themselves around the perimeter of the woods, each carrying blessed weapons and protective medicines. The air grew colder as night deepened, and strange lights flickered between the trees, not the steady beam of flashlights, but something wild and ethereal. That's when we heard it, a sound that started as a low hum and grew into a bone-rattling vibration. The snow beneath our feet seemed to tremble, and the trees swayed despite the lack of wind. Nodin pressed against my leg, whining softly. It emerged from between two ancient pines, larger than before, its fur now streaked with silver in the moonlight. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, shifting in and out of visibility, like heat waves over hot pavement, more shapes moved, smaller versions of the creature, as if it had been breeding. "Dear God," Charlie whispered, raising his rifle. The creature's eyes found mine, and in that moment I felt its hunger, its ancient rage, its desire to tear apart not just our bodies, but the very fabric of our reality. It had been testing us before, learning our weaknesses. Now it was ready to claim this territory as its own. Old Joe's voice rang out, strong and clear, chanting words in our ancient language. Other voices joined his, the sound seeming to make the air itself vibrate. The creature's offspring wavered like bad television reception, their forms becoming less substantial. But the parent creature, the one I'd wounded, remained solid. It threw back its head and let out a roar that shook snow from the trees, then charged directly at me. I fired my rifle, the blessed bullet striking true, tearing a hole in the creature's shoulder that leaked black blood and silvery light. Charlie's shot followed, then another from somewhere in the trees. The beast staggered but didn't fall. Nodin, brave fool that he was, darted forward, no longer afraid. The creature swung at him, but this time the dog was ready, dodging the massive claws and latching onto its leg. The beast's children tried to aid their parent, but they seemed unable to fully materialize, passing through solid objects like smoke. The chanting grew louder, and I could feel something building in the air, a pressure like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Mrs. Thompson appeared beside me, her voice rising above the others, holding something in her hands that glowed with an inner light. The creature turned toward her, sensing the threat. It moved with that terrible speed again, but this time I was ready. I threw myself into its path, my blessed knife finding its mark just below its throat. The blade sank deep, and the beast's blood burned like acid where it touched my skin. What happened next, I'm still not sure I can fully explain. The world seemed to fold in on itself, reality bending like paper in the wind. Through the creature's wound I caught glimpses of another place, a dark realm where shapes moved that hurt my eyes to look at. Mrs. Thompson's voice reached a crescendo, and the glowing object in her hands, what looked like a simple piece of quartz, erupted with blinding light. The creature's offspring dissipated like mist in the morning sun, but their parent fought against whatever power was being wielded. It grabbed me with one massive paw, claws sinking into my shoulder, trying to drag me with it as it was pulled back toward that other world. The pain was incredible, but through it I could hear old Joe shouting instructions. "Let go of the knife, Elan, let it take it." With the last of my strength I twisted the knife deeper, then released my grip. The creature stumbled backward, the blessed blade still embedded in its flesh. Light poured from the wound now, and the beast's form began to waver like its children had. The ceremony reached its peak. Dozens of voices joined in ancient words of power. The creature thrashed and howled, its form stretching and distorting as it was pulled between worlds. Those terrible eyes locked onto mine one last time, filled with a hatred that promised this wasn't over. Then, with a sound like thunder underground, it vanished. The tear in reality sealed itself with a flash of light that left us all blinking at after images. The woods fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the soft crunch of snow beneath shifting feet. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Noden broke the spell by trotting over to me, tail wagging, as if we'd just finished a normal hunt. The tension broke, and people began moving, checking on each other, treating wounds. My shoulder healed slowly, the claw marks leaving scars that tingled whenever storms approached. Old Joe explained that the creature hadn't been destroyed. Such things couldn't be truly killed by mortal weapons. But the ceremony, combined with the blessed weapons, had forced it back to its own realm and sealed the pathway it had used to enter our world. "Will it come back?" I asked him one evening, months later, as we sat on my shop's porch watching the sunset. "Maybe," he said honestly. "These beings are patient, and they hold grudges. But we're stronger now. We remember the old ways, and we're ready. Sometimes remembering is the most powerful weapon we have." The woods have been quiet since that night, but I keep the protective medicines Mrs. Thompson gave me hanging in my shop. Charlie and I still patrol regularly, and Noden hasn't lost his watchfulness. The younger generation, who once smiled politely but dismissively at the old stories, now listens intently when the elders speak. As for me, I've learned to balance the modern world of engines and electronics with the older world of spirits and shadows. My grandfather would be proud, I think. He always said that surviving in this world meant keeping one foot in the past and one in the present, understanding both the physical and spiritual aspects of existence. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the pines, I think I catch glimpses of movement in the darkness, or hear sounds that don't quite belong. But I'm not afraid anymore. Our community stands together, guardians of an ancient knowledge that's as relevant today as it was centuries ago. The creature may return someday, or others of its kind might find their way through the thin places between worlds. But we'll be ready. We remember the old ways now, and we watch the woods. After all, that's what my ancestors did, and that's what I'll teach my children to do. Because some stories aren't just stories and some monsters are real. But so is the strength we find in standing together, in remembering who we are and where we come from. The worst part about living on a reservation in the middle of the Adirondacks isn't the isolation, it's the silence. There's a heaviness to it, a weight that hangs in the air, especially at night. I've lived my whole life here in the St. Lawrence County region of New York, surrounded by the dense forest and the old winding roads that cut through the landscape like veins. The silence out here feels unnatural at times, but I've always chalked it up to the wilderness. My name is Harlan Tyaga. I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation, born and raised in this county. My people have been here for centuries, but me, I've always felt a bit out of place. Even among my own community, I'm known as the skeptic, the one who chose a badge and a conservation officer's uniform over traditional ways. My grandfather used to tell me I was too quick to dismiss the old stories, too eager to explain everything through the lens of modern science. Maybe he was right. I've spent the last decade patrolling these woods, making sure no one's poaching or dumping. It's usually quiet work, checking permits, documenting wildlife patterns, occasionally helping lost hikers find their way back to marked trails. The monotony of it suited me fine. I had my routine: wake up before dawn, check my gear, drive the winding roads in my department-issued truck, and listen to the forest's rhythms. But lately those rhythms have changed. The birds don't sing like they used to. The deer, usually abundant in these parts, have become scarce. Even the insects seem subdued. At first I attributed it to the unusually cold spring we'd been having. Nature has its cycles, after all. But deep down, something felt wrong. The silence had taken on a different quality, expectant, like the pause before a thunderclap. I live alone in a small house on the edge of the reservation, where the manicured lawns of the community give way to wild undergrowth. My nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away, an arrangement that's always suited me fine. But lately I found myself leaving the TV on at night, just to have some background noise. The silence has become oppressive, almost like a physical presence pressing against my windows after dark. Last night I woke up at 3 a.m. to complete stillness. No wind in the trees, no distant howl of coyotes, not even the usual creaks and settling sounds of the house. I got up to check the windows, more out of habit than any real concern. The moon was full, casting long shadows across my backyard. As I stood there, looking out at the tree line, I saw something move. Just a quick flash of movement, there and gone, like a shadow passing behind a tree. But the movement was wrong somehow, too tall, too fluid for any animal I knew. I spent the rest of the night in my chair, rifle across my lap, watching the woods. Nothing else moved, but the silence felt different now, aware, waiting. When dawn finally came, I went out to check for tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding prints, but I found nothing. No deer trails, no raccoon tracks, not even the usual signs of squirrels or rabbits. It was as if the wildlife had simply vanished overnight. That same morning I got the call about Jacob Running Deer's disappearance. Jacob was an old friend, someone I'd known since childhood. He was an experienced hunter who knew these woods as well as anyone. The type of person who could walk blindfolded through the forest and still find his way home. His wife called it in. He'd gone out hunting the previous afternoon and never returned. I remember standing in their kitchen taking notes as Sarah, Jacob's wife, described his last known movements. She was calm, almost eerily so, but her hands shook as she clutched her coffee mug. "He always comes back before dark," she kept saying, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on something distant. Always. The search began immediately. We called in every available officer, organized volunteer groups, brought in search dogs from the county sheriff's department. The dogs seemed agitated from the start, whining and pulling at their leads in confused circles instead of tracking a scent. Their handlers couldn't explain it. It was as if Jacob had simply vanished into thin air. 3 days into the search, we found his rifle leaning against a tree, about 5 miles deep into the woods. The gun was clean, unfired, with no signs of struggle around it. Just beyond it, we found his tracks in some soft earth. They led straight into a dense thicket of pine trees, then stopped. Not like someone had covered them up or walked backward. They just ended, as if Jacob had been plucked right off the ground. That's when the whispers started. The elders began holding private meetings in the community center. I caught fragments of conversations about old things and sacred boundaries being crossed. My grandfather would have understood their cryptic warnings, but I was raised with satellite TV and internet access. I wanted facts, evidence, something I could touch and measure and understand. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, staring at those abruptly ended footprints, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child. Real, primal fear. Not the rational concern of a law enforcement officer, but the deep, instinctive terror of something fundamental being wrong with the world. The silence in the woods seemed to pulse around us, like a living thing. I didn't sleep that night, or much in the nights that followed. The search for Jacob continued, but without any real hope of finding him. The official story would eventually list him as missing, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. But I knew better. Something had taken Jacob, something that moved through these ancient woods like a shadow, leaving no trace except the growing silence in its wake. Little did I know, Jacob was just the beginning. The disappearance of the hiker from Albany came exactly 2 weeks after Jacob vanished. His name was Michael Chin, a software engineer who'd driven up from the city for a weekend of solo hiking. His wife reported him missing when he failed to check in at their predetermined time. The description was frustratingly familiar. Experienced outdoorsman, well-prepared, proper equipment. Gone without a trace. I led the search team that found his campsite. Everything was in perfect order. Tent properly pitched, sleeping bag neatly rolled, cooking equipment cleaned and stored. His backpack sat inside the tent, containing his wallet, phone, and satellite beacon. The beacon had never been activated. The only sign of disturbance was a single boot print leading away from the camp, as if he'd started to take a step, and then nothing. The forest around the campsite was different from what I remembered. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at midday, the ground lay in perpetual twilight. The air felt thick, stagnant, like breathing through a wet cloth. And that silence, that oppressive, watching silence, pressed in from all sides. I noticed something else, too, something that sent a chill down my spine despite the warm spring air. The trees surrounding the campsite bore marks, deep parallel grooves carved into their bark at varying heights. Some were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. Others looked older, weathered, as if whatever had made them had been returning to this spot for years. The state police attributed the marks to bears, but I'd seen bear marks before. These were different, too precise, too deliberate, and they were everywhere, forming a rough circle around the campsite, like some kind of boundary marker, or a trap. That night I drove home along the winding forest roads, my headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The trees seemed to press in closer to the road than usual, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I found myself driving faster than usual, checking my rearview mirror more often than necessary. The darkness beyond my headlights seemed alive somehow, shifting and moving in ways that darkness shouldn't. When I got home, I pulled out my grandfather's old journals. He'd kept detailed records of tribal histories, stories passed down through generations. I'd always dismissed them as superstition, but now I wasn't so sure. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there were reports of people vanishing in these woods, not just getting lost or dying from exposure, but disappearing completely, without a trace. The entries described something the elders called the Hungry One, a creature that walked like a man but wasn't, that could move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf, that left no tracks except for the marks it carved into trees to mark its territory. The stories said it didn't just hunt for food, it hunted for sport, for pleasure, taking its victims when they were alone and vulnerable. I stayed up late into the night, reading account after account. The details varied, but certain elements remained constant. The unnatural silence before someone vanished, the strange marks on trees, the way the forest itself seemed to change, becoming darker, more hostile. The same things I'd been noticing over the past few weeks. The last entry in my grandfather's journal was dated just a few months before his death. It was different from the others, more urgent, more personal. He wrote about feeling watched whenever he went into the woods, about hearing something moving through the trees at night, something that walked on two legs but wasn't human. The final line sent a chill through me. It's waking up again. The silence is spreading. May the Creator help us all. The days following Michael Chen's disappearance brought subtle but undeniable changes to the reservation. People stopped going into the woods alone. Parents kept their children closer to home. The usual sounds of life, kids playing, dogs barking, the general bustle of the community seemed muted, as if everyone was unconsciously trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. I spent my days patrolling, but the job felt different now. Every shadow held potential threats. Every unexpected sound made me reach for my rifle. The forest itself seemed to have changed, becoming more primeval, more threatening. The familiar trails I'd walked hundreds of times felt foreign, as if the woods were slowly erasing themselves and becoming something else, something older and more dangerous. The elders called a community meeting in the reservation's cultural center. I attended more out of duty than belief, but what I heard there shook me more than I wanted to admit. They spoke of cycles, of ancient agreements between our people and the things that lived in these woods long before humans arrived. They talked about boundaries being crossed, sacred places disturbed, and the price that always came due. Martha Whitedeer, one of our oldest tribal members, stood up to speak. Her voice was sharp and clear despite her age, carrying to every corner of the room. "The modern world has made us forget," she said, looking directly at me. "We thought we could ignore the old ways, pretend the ancient ones didn't exist, but they never left. They were just sleeping, and now they're awake again." After the meeting, Martha pulled me aside. Her grip on my arm was surprisingly strong, her dark eyes intense. "Your grandfather knew," she said. "He tried to warn us the last time, but no one listened. Now it's happening again, and you're the one who needs to understand." She pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch on a cord, decorated with intricate beadwork. "Wear this," she said. "It won't stop it, but it might help you see it coming." "And Harlan?" She squeezed my arm harder. When you hear the silence, run. Run as fast as you can. I took the pouch home, meaning to toss it in a drawer and forget about it. But something made me put it around my neck instead. The leather was soft with age, and it carried a faint, pleasant smell of sage and sweetgrass. That night, I dreamed of the forest, but not as I knew it. In the dream, the trees were wrong somehow, twisted and ancient, their branches reaching down like claws. And through the trees, something moved, something tall and dark that walked on two legs but wasn't human. The next morning, I woke to news of another disappearance. This time it was closer to home. Eli Littlebird, a 17-year-old kid who'd gone fishing at Sweeney Pond. His father found his fishing rod by the water's edge, the line still in the water, but no sign of Eli. The ground around the pond was too rocky for tracks, but I found something else. Those same deep claw marks on the trees, fresh enough that sap still oozed from them. As I stood there examining the marks, I felt the pouch around my neck grow warm. At the same moment, I noticed the silence. Not just quiet, but that absolute unnatural stillness I'd come to dread. Even the water of the pond seemed to stop moving, its surface becoming mirror smooth despite the light breeze. That's when I heard it, a sound like something heavy being dragged through the underbrush just beyond the tree line. My hand went to my rifle as I turned slowly, scanning the dense foliage. For a moment, nothing moved. Then I saw it, and everything I thought I knew about the world changed forever. The creature that emerged from the trees defied everything I understood about natural law. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size, its massive frame easily 7 feet tall but somehow appearing even larger. The matted fur that covered its body was an impossible color, not black or brown, but a shade that seemed to absorb light itself. Its arms were wrong, too long for its body, ending in hands that were almost human but not quite, with fingers that terminated in curved claws as long as hunting knives. But it was the face that struck the deepest chord of terror in me. The head was wolfish in shape, but the eyes were different. They held an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory but also eerily self-aware. Time seemed to slow as we regarded each other. The creature's breath came in slow, steam-like puffs despite the warm spring air. I could smell it now, a thick, musty odor like wet fur and rotting meat, undercut with something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. My training took over, and I raised my rifle. The movement seemed to trigger something in the creature. It lunged forward with impossible speed, covering the distance between us in a single bound. I fired, the shot deafening in the unnatural silence. The bullet struck it square in the chest, and I saw blood spray dark, almost black against its fur. But it didn't stop. If anything, the wound seemed to enrage it. I fired again, aiming for the head this time. The shot connected, tearing away a chunk of flesh above its eye, but still it came. Its claws raked the air where my head had been a split second before as I dove to the side. I rolled, coming up in a crouch, but the creature was already on me. Its weight hit me like a truck, knocking me flat. The rifle went flying. Hot breath washed over my face, carrying that terrible smell. Claws tore into my jacket, and I felt sharp pain as they found flesh beneath. Pure instinct drove me to reach for my hunting knife. I plunged the blade into its side, feeling it sink deep into muscle and tissue. The creature's roar was like nothing I'd ever heard. Not animal, not human, but something in between. The sound seemed to vibrate in my chest, making my teeth ache. It reared back, giving me the opening I needed. I scrambled away, lunging for my rifle. My hands were slick with blood, mine or its, I couldn't tell, but I managed to chamber another round. The creature gathered itself for another attack, and I saw my chance. As it launched itself forward, I fired directly into its throat. The impact knocked it backward. Blood sprayed in an arc, black in the dim light. The creature stumbled, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. It tried to rise once more, then collapsed. Its body twitched violently for several long moments before finally going still. I stayed where I was, rifle trained on its motionless form, waiting for it to move again. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, I approached cautiously, every nerve screaming at me to run. The creature was massive up close, its body radiating heat even in death. The fur was coarse under my hand, and beneath it, the muscle structure felt wrong, dense and layered in ways that didn't match any animal I knew. That's when I heard the voices calling my name. The search party for Eli had followed the sounds of gunfire. I was suddenly struck by the reality of what lay before me, physical proof of something that shouldn't exist. Part of me wanted to drag the body away, hide it before anyone else saw it. But I knew that wasn't an option. This was evidence, and maybe, just maybe, it would help us understand what we were dealing with. The others arrived minutes later. Their reactions ranged from shock to terror to disbelief. Someone called for backup, and soon the area was swarming with police, wildlife officials, and eventually men in dark suits who arrived in unmarked vehicles. They took the body away that night. I gave my statement multiple times, each version carefully recorded and documented. They took my clothes for analysis, photograph. They took blood samples, photographs, measurements. Everything was documented with clinical precision, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the way their hands shook as they worked. The men in suits asked countless questions, always circling back to the same points. Had I seen anything like this before? Had there been any strange animal attacks in the area? What did I know about local legends? I told them everything, except about Martha's pouch. Something told me to keep that detail to myself. The whole time we talked, I could feel the leather against my chest, still warm to the touch. When they finally left, taking the creature's body with them, I went straight to Martha's house. She was waiting for me on her porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the mild evening. "You saw it," she said. It wasn't a question. "And you killed it." She gestured for me to sit beside her on the worn wooden bench. "What was it?" I asked, my voice hoarse from hours of questioning. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the darkening tree line. "We don't speak its true name," she finally said. "Names have power, but it's been here as long as our people have, maybe longer. There used to be more of them, before the Europeans came with their guns and their iron." "More of them?" The thought made my blood run cold. She nodded slowly. "They hunt in pairs, always pairs, if you killed one." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The next few days passed in a blur of official statements and debriefings. The story was kept quiet. A mountain lion attack, they told the press. The missing people were still missing persons cases, officially unsolved. But word spread through the reservation like wildfire. Everyone knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know exactly what. I threw myself into research, pulling every record I could find of similar incidents. The pattern was there if you knew where to look. Pairs of disappearances every few decades, always in the same general area. The victims were always alone when taken, always in or near the woods. And always the disappearances were preceded by reports of unusual silence in the forest. A week after I killed the creature, the silence returned. Not gradually this time, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. I was at home when it happened, cleaning my rifle for the 100th time since the encounter. One moment, the normal sounds of evening crickets, distant traffic, the hum of my refrigerator. The next, nothing. The pouch around my neck grew hot enough to burn. I grabbed my rifle and extra ammunition, moving on instinct now. As I stepped onto my porch, I saw movement at the tree line, a flash of something tall and dark slipping between the trees. The same fluid motion I'd seen before, but faster now, more purposeful. I knew with absolute certainty that it was hunting me. My truck was parked 20 yards away. I made it halfway there before I heard it behind me, that wet, dragging sound I remembered from before. I spun, rifle raised, but saw nothing except shadows moving in impossible ways. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse and shift, as if the night itself was alive. When it finally showed itself, I almost missed it. It emerged from the shadows like it was made of them, its form seeming to solidify out of the darkness itself. Larger than the first one, its fur so dark it created a void in the dim light. But the eyes were the same, intelligent, hate-filled, hungry. I fired without hesitation, but it was ready this time. It moved with impossible speed, dodging the shot and closing the distance between us in 2 massive strides. I tried to chamber another round, but it was too close. Its claws caught the barrel of the rifle, tearing it from my hands with enough force to send me stumbling backward. The world narrowed to pure survival instinct. I ran, not toward my truck. It was between me and the vehicle now, but toward the woods. I could hear it behind me, its breathing heavy and wet, its footfalls somehow silent despite its size. The pouch around my neck burned like a coal. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness between the trees. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept moving. Somewhere in the back of my mind I realized I was heading toward the old burial grounds, sacred land that our people had protected for generations. Behind me, the creature's pursuit suddenly became audible, crashing through undergrowth, branches snapping under its weight. It was getting closer. I could smell its rank odor on the wind, hear its labored breathing. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I broke through the tree line into the clearing where our ancestors were buried. Ancient stone markers rose from the ground, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen. The moment I crossed the boundary marked by the stones, the creature's pursuit stopped. I turned to see it standing at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the darker woods behind it. It paced back and forth like a caged animal, never crossing the invisible line marked by the burial stones. Its eyes glowed with an inner light in the darkness, fixed on me with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, me in the clearing, it prowling the perimeter. As moonlight broke through the clouds, I could see other shapes moving in the woods behind it, just at the edge of visibility. Not animals, but something else, something that walked upright but wasn't human. Dawn found me still in the clearing, my back against one of the larger burial stones. The creature was gone, vanishing with the first light of morning, but I waited until the sun was fully up before moving. My body ached from the night's ordeal, and the scratches on my arms where its claws had grazed me burned like fire. Martha was waiting when I finally made it back to the reservation. She took one look at me and led me inside her house, sat me down at her kitchen table, and poured me a cup of strong tea. Only then did she speak. "You understand now," she said, not a question but a statement. "Why the old ways matter, why we keep the traditions." I nodded, my hands shaking slightly as I lifted the cup. The burial ground, it couldn't cross the boundary. Why? "Sacred ground," she said simply. "They're bound by older laws than ours, laws written in blood and bone and time itself." She touched the pouch around my neck. "This helped you see it coming, but it was your grandfather's blood in your veins that saved you. The old powers recognized their own." "What do we do now?" I asked. Martha's expression grew grave. "Now we prepare. You killed its mate, and it won't stop until it balances the scales. More will come. The hunger always spreads. The silence will grow deeper. And we must remember what our ancestors knew. Some borders aren't meant to be crossed." That was 3 months ago. The official investigations have gone cold. The missing persons cases remain open but inactive. Life on the reservation has changed in subtle but significant ways. No one goes into the woods alone anymore. The old traditions are being revived. Protective symbols painted on doors, offerings left at the edges of the forest, ancient words spoken before sunset. I still patrol, but never alone now. We go in pairs, armed not just with rifles but with sacred herbs and blessed objects. The silence comes and goes, moving through the forest like a tide. Sometimes at night I see eyes watching from the darkness beyond my windows, eyes that glow with that terrible intelligence I've come to recognize. The creature hasn't shown itself again, not directly, but I know it's out there. The claw marks appear on trees closer to the reservation with each passing week. Animals are found torn apart in ways that can't be explained. The silence grows deeper, spreading like a stain through the woods. I wear Martha's pouch always now, and I've learned to read the signs it shows me, the way it warms when danger is near, how it seems to pull in certain directions, warning me away from places where the veils between worlds have grown thin. I've started keeping my own journal, recording everything I see and learn. Someday someone else might need this knowledge. The elders say this is just the beginning, that what we're seeing is part of a larger cycle, a awakening of things that have slept for generations. They might be right. All I know is that the forest has changed, or maybe I have. The silence that hangs over these woods isn't just absence of sound anymore, it's presence of something else, something ancient and hungry and patient. Every night before I sleep, I check my rifle and renew the protective markings on my doors and windows. Every morning I look for new signs in the woods around my home, and I wonder, not for the first time, if this is how my grandfather felt in his final years, watching, waiting, knowing that something terrible was waking up in these ancient woods. The silence deepens with each passing day, and somewhere in the darkness, something waits, watching, hungry, patient. It knows, as I do, that this story isn't over, it's only beginning. Winter came early that year. By October, the first snow was already clinging to the branches, turning the forest into a maze of white and shadow. The cold should have driven the creature deeper into the woods, but instead the signs of its presence grew more frequent. Claw marks appeared on trees just yards from homes. Livestock vanished from barns that had been locked and secured. The silence expanded, creating dead zones where even radio signals couldn't penetrate. I spent my nights plotting locations on maps, trying to find a pattern in its movements. Martha helped, using knowledge passed down through generations to interpret signs I would have missed. Together we began to see something emerging. The creature wasn't just hunting randomly. It was moving in a specific pattern, marking points that formed a massive circle around the reservation. "It's creating a boundary," Martha explained one evening, her finger tracing the points we'd marked, like the one around the burial ground, but in reverse. Instead of keeping itself out, it's trying to keep us in. "Why?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Winter is coming," she said simply, "and it needs to feed." The tribal council met in secret, away from the prying eyes of state officials and wildlife authorities. The elders shared what they knew, stories passed down through generations, accounts of similar incidents from centuries past. One detail kept recurring. The creatures hunted in pairs not just for efficiency, but because they needed each other to maintain their connection to our world. When one died, the other would try to replace it, transforming a human victim into something like itself. That's what it had been doing all along, testing us, selecting potential replacements. The disappearances weren't just about food, they were trials, tests of strength and will, and now, with winter approaching, it would make its final choice. "How do we stop it?" I asked. The oldest of the elders, Joseph Blackfeather, spoke up. "In the old stories, our ancestors drove them back using sacred fire and iron blessed by tribal shamans. But the ritual required sacrifice, a willing offering of blood from someone of the tribal bloodline." All eyes turned to me. As the one who had killed its mate, as someone with the old blood running in my veins, I was the logical choice. The pouch around my neck grew warm, almost seeming to pulse in agreement. The next week was spent in preparation. I learned the old words, the prayers and invocations that had been passed down through generations. My rifle rounds were blessed and marked with ancient symbols. The elders performed ceremonies I hadn't seen since my grandfather's time, drawing power from the land itself to strengthen the barriers around our sacred spaces. Martha worked tirelessly, teaching me what I needed to know. "The creature is powerful," she explained, "but it's bound by rules older than itself. It can't cross certain boundaries without invitation. It can't take someone who's protected by the old ways unless they willingly surrender that protection." The plan was dangerous in its simplicity. We would use me as bait, drawing the creature to the burial ground. Once there, the combined power of the sacred space and the blessed weapons might be enough to destroy it, but the cost would be high. "The blood sacrifice isn't just symbolic," Martha warned. "To close the door it's trying to open, someone of the old bloodline has to be willing to give their life. Are you sure about this?" I thought about Jacob, about Eli, about all the others who had vanished into that unnatural silence. I thought about my grandfather, who had tried to warn us all those years ago. "I'm sure," I said. The full moon rose over fresh snow, turning the forest into a landscape of silver and shadow. I stood at the edge of the burial ground, the blessed rifle in my hands, Martha's pouch burning against my chest. The elders had formed a circle around the sacred space, their chants rising and falling in the cold air. The silence came suddenly, more complete than I'd ever felt it before. The pouch around my neck grew hot enough to blister, and then I saw it, emerging from the darkness between the trees, its massive form somehow darker than the shadows around it. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came other shapes, twisted, half-formed things that moved in ways that hurt the eyes to watch. I recognized something in their movements, their forms. They were the missing ones. Jacob, Eli, all the others, transformed but not completely, caught between human and monster. The creature stopped at the edge of the burial ground, its eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. Then it spoke, not in words, but in images and sensations that filled my mind. It showed me what it was offering: power, immortality, a chance to become something more than human. All I had to do was step outside the sacred circle. For a moment I was tempted. The power it offered was real. I could feel it, taste it. But then I remembered my grandfather's words, written in his final journal entry. Some prices are too high, no matter what's being offered. I raised the rifle and began the ancient words Martha had taught me. The creature snarled, its form seeming to ripple and shift. The transformed ones behind it moved forward, their not quite human forms pressing against the invisible barrier of the sacred ground. The elders' chants grew louder, and I felt something shift in the air, like a current of electricity running through the ground beneath my feet. The creature howled, a sound that contained all the hunger and rage of centuries. It rushed forward, crossing the barrier as if it wasn't there. I had time for one shot, the blessed bullet striking true, right where Martha had said the heart would be. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through flesh and bone. As my blood soaked into the sacred earth, I saw something change in the creature's eyes. Not defeat exactly, but recognition. The transformed ones behind it began to fade, their forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. The creature itself seemed to be coming apart, its edges blurring and dispersing. The last thing I remember was Martha's voice, speaking words in our ancient language, and the sensation of something vast and hungry finally being put to rest. I woke up 3 days later in the tribal clinic. The physical wounds were severe but not fatal. The sacrifice had been accepted without requiring my death. The creature was gone, and with it, the unnatural silence that had plagued our woods. They never found the missing people, but sometimes, on very quiet nights, I think I can hear something in the forest. Not the hungry silence of before, but something almost like singing, as if the lost ones have found their way to somewhere else, somewhere better. I still wear Martha's pouch, though it no longer burns with warning. The claw marks on the trees have begun to heal, and wildlife has returned to the woods. But things are different now. The reservation has changed. The old ways are being taught again, the ancient boundaries maintained and respected. As for me, I continue my patrols, but with new understanding. The woods are deep and old and full of secrets. Some of those secrets are better left undisturbed. But if something wakes again, if that hungry silence returns, we'll be ready. Because some stories don't end. They just wait for the next chapter to begin. And in the deep woods of St. Lawrence County, the trees remember and the shadows watch, and the ancient rhythms continue, as they have for countless generations before us, and will for countless generations to come.